That is... Oh, God, that's clipping. That's going to be fun. Take that down just a tad. Hello, everyone. How are we doing? Hello. Welcome to Brew Ships. Let's see who we've got. Hello, John Shea. Sorry I'm running a couple minutes late. I could come up with a fancy reason for why, but there was a great video of some Great Western trains that popped up on Facebook, and I just clicked on it and thought that'll be a couple minutes, and it turned out to be about 7 minutes. And once you're into it, you don't want to pause it for later, especially when it's only about another minute or so. So let's see. Gasman, if St. Nicholas's sleigh is pulled by reindeers, the hogfires of the wild boar, what animals would pull the late day biplane? Do you mean the latter day biplane? And this is starting to worry me that the Blackburn is turning into an actual proper religion. I'm expecting at some point to get a gentleman from the Census Bureau dropping of national census knocking on my door, going, "Excuse me, sir. Do you know what Blackburn religion means?" And the reason I say gentlemen is because I'm fairly sure all the female members of the organization which does it would be giggling their heads off and going, "You idiot," basically saying things along the lines of, "You can go look if you want to, but we're not getting involved in this one. We've got far better things to do with our time." So, and yeah, I'm going to go for bunnies if we're going to go for something pulling it. Hello, Jess P. Can only watch intermittently today. Well, that's a shame, but hope you enjoy what you do see. Hello, Stafford Thompson. I sent you a message on Discord this morning. Do you hope it helped lighten the end of the 1 week in Southern Union? No. It did. I'm sorry I haven't responded to it. I've been... Honestly, if I'm being honest, I've been buried by dealing with chapters 3 and 4 of my book and making sure they're all prepped and going to the publishers. The publishers have got them, sent them back to me, and now I'm proofing and going over the publishers' versions, and they had some interesting questions. Like, what is a chasing fleet action? Came through from the editors. They'd never heard about that one before. And then I realised it was actually something like strategical, which is a phraseology which only really appears in the 1920s and 30s. So, hey-ho. Because you have to remember, in the 1920s and 30s, there's all sorts of things developed. Then World War II happens. They're mostly stepped on. Then NATO's formed, and a lot of the lexicon is lost. A lot of the individual British, French, Italian lexicon for operations is lost, and even some of the American lexicon is lost as they decide to sort of fuse their lexicons together to create this new strategic and tactical language that will span NATO. And so this means a lot of things are lost, including, sadly enough, chasing action. So it literally is in the language for about 30 years, and unless you are talking about destroyers, and specifically fleet destroyers which might be used for those sort of operations, you are probably not going to come across it. Hello, Plebiscite. Hello, DGV40. Hello, Martin Dock. Hello, Aviator Enterprise. Dunrick Ironhammer. Hello. And they did it. Does it sound... does sound like a great reason. Yeah, it does. Also, I have something called a chunky cherry muffin. I'm not sure where they come from, but they got put in front of me. I'm also not sure why Praise of the Blackburn is now being blocked by YouTube's censors. I have no idea on that one. Edinburgh sounds like law firm. Publishing does sound like a lot like a law firm. Good evening, Grisowski. Good evening, Buccaneer. Hello, King's Rook. Evan Van Height. Hello. Cahedron. Hello. Right then. Once it's all over, I hope you take a very well-deserved vacation once it's over. I'm possibly going to take a couple of weeks break before I chuck myself into something next. Oh, good lord, I'm only 33 subscribers off 5,000. I didn't realise that today. Well, thank you very much to everyone. That's slightly worrying that I'm 33 off 5,000. I didn't think I'd done that well, but, thank you. Let's see. Da-da-da. So, how is everyone doing today? So today's collection of books is a bit of a sort of interesting thing. I've had 7 books sent to me to review, and I've added in 3 of my own as a bit of a Christmas suggestions, and I'm probably also going to take any question about books, and if they come in, I'll put them and show them as well. Going Gasword, Bunnies, I've got one to volunteer. Well, as you're picking up on the t-shirt, that is correct. Caden, just been reading about Indianapolis. It's depressing. That is rather interesting, because just before you came in, one of the books I've been reading today and looking up was this book, In Harm's Way by Doug Stanton. It's all about USS Indianapolis, and it's a really cool book. It is a cool one. McCoy could feel this last explosion reverberating in his bones, his gut. He was swimming harder than he'd ever swum in his life, trying desperately to flee the ship as she plummeted to the bottom of the sea. As he swam, he felt something reach out and grab his left leg and tug off his shoe, and then it jerked him back in his swimming stroke, pulling him underwater, dragging him down deep. The last thing he remembered before blacking out was the rush of water past his face, and the sensation that his eyes were ready to pop under the increasing pressure. When he snapped back to consciousness, he found himself shooting to the surface at great speed, like a man in an express elevator. He was not in an elevator, though. He was in an air bubble, a huge one, and its dry jaws were clamped around the lower half of his body, leaving his head and shoulders sticking out as he rocketed upward. He erupted with such force that he rose 3 feet out of the water. With a splash, he fell back into the black world of screaming men, All around him, the sea was littered with crates of potatoes, ammunition, cans, stray life vests, and dead bodies. He looked around and knew he had one decision to make. Am I going to live, or will I die? That is a good one. Let's see. Evan Van Great, I'm doing quite well, thanks for asking. I got a lazy Sunday ahead of me over here in the States. Nice. Lazy Sunday is always fun. Afternoon, Jeff Beeler. Bofors Oricon. Kaigan and Freeman's Destroyer book for Christmas this year, I think. That is a good one. Kingsrook, wondering if you saw the pair of tweets I pointed you towards on Discord. Possibly, but possibly I didn't, because sometimes Discord seems to be... Sometimes I get those red notifications that say I've been mentioned, and I go hunting, and I can't find where I've been mentioned. I click on them. It doesn't show me. Jess B, very well, thanks. My sister is visiting to do the Christmas decorating. Not my favourite thing. I have to say, I can understand that. I do personally love doing the Christmas decorations. My house is usually semi-visible from space. But, yes, there are certainly large members of my family who do not enjoy it as much as I do. Graham Metrovic, when does your book on tribal classes come out? It's Tribal Battles and Darings, and it comes out in March next year. Hello, Atomic Babel. Hi, Felix B. Hi, Howard Maxine. And Melanie6040. How long ago did you start? About 12 minutes, according to my beautiful timer up top here. Rabbit Razorback. Good afternoon. The Indianapolis is an excellent example of why ships should travel in pairs. Or at least in a wider task force. There again, both Glorious and Courageous are examples of why ships should travel in a task force. Andrew Bend. No need to worry. Joe Hiller. What has been the most notable new Heuvel history of this year? That's an interesting question. What have been the most notable projects? I've seen a fair number of decent books. I can decide what's the most notable of the books I've got here today to go through. Oh, it summarized the differences. Tweets. Dr. Samuel McLean was... Sam was wondering about cruiser hull and destroyer hull differences. I'll have to do that to him. Sometimes he messages me, and usually I try and remember to respond, but sometimes I do forget that I'm busy editing myself. Because we work together on Global Maritime History. Rapid Razorback, would you rather deal with the census or MI5? MI5 tend to be more fun. In harm's way. In 1991, Desert Storm B-52 was hit by a Haarr anti-radiation missile, which locked onto the tail gunner's radar. The buff was repaired and renamed In Harm's Way. The B-52 stories are legendary. I'm reading through Great Naval Wonders. I accept it's going to have a slant to it. Most of them do, Geirr. In fact, that's one of the first books we'll sort of get to at some point. It has a big slant to it. I'll probably get to that at some point. No one deliberately sacrifices a heavy cruiser, no matter how many more you have. But it's kind of like the order she was sailing under, like the orders certain other ships were sailing under during Norway crisis, do lead to a lot of conspiracy theories, because orders which make sense in time of war do not make sense necessarily after that war. What ship was that guy on? Indianapolis. It's in harm's way. It's a Doug Stanton book. Another idea is book reviews. Well, you know. So, I'm going to do the old books first, and then I'm going to go through the new books, because that gets that sort of the older books are slightly easier to go through, because I can be more quickly with them, because they haven't been sent to me specifically to be reviewed, and I don't, I feel like I have to be very, sort of judicious in a way. I would have to say this book is, if you haven't got it, and you're at all interested in World War II, you're at all interested in naval warfare, I think this book is one of the best ones you can get. And for a Christmas, for anyone who's interested in these sort of things, it is actually a really cool book. It's got a lot of pictures, and it's got a lot of good history in it. And the thing is, because it's divided up into chapters, you can read it as a whole thing. But if you're someone who's just getting interested in history and you just want to maybe read a chapter at a time, it is easily divided enough that you can go very, very chapter-like. So, let's start off with MTB 718 and what she gets up to. This is Chapter 9, and it's MTB 718. Clandestine operations to the shores of Brittany and Norway. There is every justification for including the clandestine work of MTB 718 in a history of the operations of the dogboats, as it illustrates sharply the tremendous variety of tasks that fell to the boats, and their versatility. Mention was made briefly in Chapter 2 of Captain Frank Slocum, RN, whose department in the Admiralty was known as DDODI, Deputy Director Operations Divisions, Irregular. Back in 1941, the boats at his disposal, many of which came from coastal forces and were largely C-class MGBs, were assigned from time to clandestine operations. As demands for the expertise of his department increased, the decision was made to form a flotilla specifically at his disposal, and it was designated the 15th MGB flotilla. The early plans for the composition of the flotilla included the C-class MGB 314, commanded by Lieutenant Dustin Curtins. But before she could take up her place, she became the headquarters ship for the Sentner's air raid, and although she got out of the inferno of the raid, albeit severely damaged, she had to be sunk by a destroyer on the return voyage. Her place in the flotilla was taken by her sister ship, MGB 318, which had a distinguished record right through to the end of the war. The next boats to be chosen were three Camper and Nicholas boats, MGBs 501, 502, and 503. 8 of this class had been ordered pre-war by the Turkish Navy and taken over before completion, and the other 5 had already been mentioned as being involved in blockade running into Sweden under mercantile flags. They were beautifully finished boats and of similar size to dogboats, alarmed. Once again, fate intervened, and 501 blew up after a galley fire on an exercise near the Longship's lighthouse. She alone of the 3 had Packard petrol engines. 502 and 503, both nearing completion, had 3 Davy Paxman diesel engines, giving a top speed of 27 knots. When they commissioned, they joined 318 and MASB 36 to form the 15th MGB flotilla at Dartmouth. CO 502 and the senior officer of the flotilla was Lieutenant Commander Peter Williams, who featured in Chapter 2 as CO in 1942 in both C-class boats and in dogboats, even then involved in clandestine operations. Captain Slocum also had another seagoing unit of non-coastal forces boats, fishing vessels, which were based in the Helford River. The 2 groups worked independently. Captain Slocum's headquarters were in London, but his operations officer, Commander E.S. Ted Davies, DSO RNR, was based in an office in the Royal Naval College of Dartmouth, and his duties included very close liaison with the CNC Plymouth and with the RAF, particularly Coastal Command. And the Beaufighters at St. Heuvel. Ted Davis had himself been on countless DDODI missions to the enemy coast, and his experience was invaluable. He had been navigating officer of the Queen Mary in peacetime, and his attention to navigation detail was vital to the success of the operations. In short, these were mainly concerned with landing of agents and the picking up of both agents and allied personnel who had evaded capture or who had escaped from prisoner of war camps. The pinpoints, chosen beaches, were invariably difficult to access in order to make the risk of sighting or detection as small as possible. This automatically meant that navigation and seamanship had to be of the highest standard. MTB 718 joined the flotilla in Dartmouth on the 26th of March 1944, having been built at Robertson's Yard at Sandbank in Holyloch, and she made her way southward, fitting in a few days working up en route at HMS B at Holyhead. Now, I could get into what this ship does, but let's put it this way. She joins, as I've just pointed out, as said, in March 1944. And yet her exploits fill by no means spread out section of books this long in wartime. It's a very, very good little book. Brecken Kennel, Gunboat 650 by the same author as Essential Reading for Ghost Horses. I would agree with that most wholeheartedly. The reason I recommend this over 650, especially if you are buying for someone who may be interested, maybe not interested, this may be their first work, which is about coastal forces, is because of its chapter and its great variety and what it gets up to, and it's a good breadth book. Often when I'm recommending books for first-time people and people who are interested in giving it as a sort of present, you want a book which has breadth, not necessarily depth, because if they only find certain areas interesting, it will definitely cover them, because it have breadth, it'll definitely find some area they're interested in. Whereas if you get them a book which has great depth, if they're not interested in it, then the whole book's a bit of a washout, and they might go away with thinking they're not interested in the topic entirely and not pick it up again. So, breadth, better usually for beginners. Rapid Roseback. Clandestine naval ops are interesting, unless you do them by submarine. There is nowhere to hide. It's an interesting time, and it's a good book. I said, it is a good book. Right then. Next one on my books for Christmas. Well, Let me just give you a list of aircraft. Avro Lancaster, Avro Tudor, Bell Air Cobra, Bell Air Comet, Bell King Cobra, Boeing Flying Fortress, Brewster Buffalo, de Havilland Sea Hornet, de Havilland Sea Mosquito, de Havilland Sea Vampire, the Flexible Deck Vampire, de Havilland Swallow, Douglas Boston 4, Fairy Gannet, Fairy Spearfish, General Aircraft GAL 56, Gloucester E2839, Gloucester Gauntlet, Gloucester Meteor variants, Grumman Bearcat, Grumman Cougar, Grumman Hellcat, Grumman Tiger Cat, Grumman Wildcat, Handley Page Hampton, Hawker P1052, Hawker Sea Fury, Hawker Sea Hawk, Horton 4, Lockheed Lightning, Martin Baker MB5, Martin Marauder, Miles M20, Miles M39B Liberia, Mitsubishi Zero Zen, North American Mustang 3, North American F-86 Sabre, North American AJI Savage, Northrop P-61A Black Widow, Reed and Sink Stersford, Saunders Rowe SRA A1, Short S-29 Half-Scale Sterling, Short Sturgeon, Sikorsky R-4B Hoverfly, Supermarine Attacker, Supermarine Seafang, Supermarine Seafire, Vickers Wellington 6, Vickers Windsor, Vultry Vengeance 4, Westland Eagle Wifelin, Westland Welkin, Western Welwyn, and Winter Zokonig. What is this book? Wings of the Weird and Wonderful by Captain Eric Winkle Brown. And it's good. It's really, really good. Now, is that there's lots of cool aircraft on the cover. That's a Black Widow. That's one of the Vampire variants, I think. Saunders Rowe, Western Whirlwind, everything. Again, I'd point out this one has good narratives in it for first-time readers. Let's see. I found an interesting series called Latin American War Series with books like A Carrot Risk by Marino Scaroni and about Argentinian carrier southerly walks and ops in the Falklands. Obscure topics. Cool. Peddler, hello. Dr. Clapp, what's your thoughts on Blindsman Bluff, the untold story of American submarine espionage? As I've just been given a copy of it as an expert's present. I think you'll enjoy it. Sure, Mac. Are those his memoirs? Oh, no, there's an actual book which is his official memoirs, but he basically, as he got older, he wrote up some of the aircraft, his notes. So his notes these are basically his notes are the source of these aircraft. So when he was flying them, he of course had to keep notes as the test pilot. And it has beautiful illustrations. It has beautiful pictures. It's just lovely. And ooh. Let's find what I'm looking for. Ah, yes. Let's see if you can guess what aircraft I'm talking about from the description. The concept of a small fighter flying boat dates back to 1918, when Supermarine built the Baby as a counter to the marauding German Brandenburg flying seaplanes, which were harassing Allied patrol airships and flying boats guarding our coastal convoys. The success of the Japanese in the Pacific, theatre of World War II, brought the idea of a flying boat fighter to surface again. And with the advent of the jet engine, the combination had exciting potential. It certainly offered solutions to the disadvantage of the draggy and somewhat fragile seaplane designs with their difficult handling characteristics on water. Saunders Roe Company started work on the specification E644 at Beaumaris on Anglesey, where their design office was located. The aircraft, so conceived, received the designation SRA-1 and was designed around two Metropolitan Vickers F2 for Burrell turbojets. These were axial flow engines, and so two could be installed side by side in a reasonable hull width. The hull shape was of a faired V form and was entirely of metal construction, as was the rest of the aircraft. The engine exhausts were towed out 5 degrees each side of the centerline. The cockpit was pressurized and was fitted with the first production Martin Baker ejection seat. 4 20mm cannon were mounted on the nose, and provision was made for carrying 2,000-pound bombs or 8 rockets. 3 prototypes of the SRA-1 were manufactured at Beaumaris and then assembled at Cowes. These were TG-263, fitted with 2 3,748-pound, that's 1,500 kilogram static thrust engines, TG-267 with 3,500-pound engines, and TG-271 with 3,800-pound engines. The first flight was made by Geoffrey Tyson on the 16th of July 1947. The second prototype went to the Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment at Felixstowe in 1948, and was off its pilot who was practicing for an air display in poor visibility when he crashed into the sea. The third prototype was magnificently displayed by Geoffrey Tyson at the 1948 Farnborough show, and with some superb low inverted flying. This was the machine I was invited to fly in 1949 when commanding Aeroflight at RAE at Farnborough. I flew down to Cowes on the morning of the 12th of August and had a briefing from Geoffrey Tyson. The fuel system consisted of 1 integral tank in each wing, flown forward of the main spar, with a total capacity of 426 gallons, or 1,937 litres, for the aircraft. The oil system was a constant loss type with a 4-gallon capacity tank. The flying controls were a combination of geared and spring tabs. Control on the water was by means of a small rudder, integral, with the rear step. It could be locked centrally when in flight or when on the water, linked to the rudder pedals. The wings were fitted with dive brakes, dive recovery flaps, and landing flaps. I clambered aboard TG-271, which was on beaching gear, and was gently eased down the slipway into the water. There, the gear was removed, and the aircraft was towed to the starting point. Starting was controlled from the starter panel on the middle dashboard, comprising an igniter switch, starter motor switch, and engine selector. The barrels both lit up first time without any trouble, so the tow was released. I had already engaged the water rudder and followed the launch out into the Cowes roads to the takeoff position, finding the aircraft surprisingly easy to maneuver. As we approached the takeoff lane, I set the flaps to up, checked the cross-balance feed off, master battery switch to flight, dive recovery brake off, and all time trimmers at 0. I had decided not to use takeoff flap, as this only improved the run time by 2 seconds and gave a nose-up effect on the upstick, due to the removal of the cushioning effect between flap and water. I opened the throttles steadily to the maximum 7,750 RPM, although the rate of operating was controlled to a set speed by a hydraulic throttle valve, irrespective of the speed at which the pilot operated the throttle levers. Acceleration was moderate, and after 2 to 3 seconds, the aircraft got up on the hump and about 20 to 30 miles per hour at a very large angle of attack at 15 degrees, and the view ahead virtually disappeared. I had been warned not to push the stick forward of neutral, otherwise porpoising might be initiated. Course underwater, use of water rudder was needed for directional control. As speed increased to about 40 miles per hour, the aircraft settled more nose down, and lateral control became effective. The unstick occurred at about after 18 seconds, or about 500 yards, and I retracted the floats before the limiting speed of 175 miles per hour was reached. These were rotated mechanically as they retracted inwards, so as to be lie inverted in the surface of the wing, thus creating minimum drag. I then disengaged the water rudder so it remained locked. Rate of climb was high at 7,600 RPM, and the aircraft exhibited good stability characteristics and also good harmony of control as I climbed to 32,000 feet. Let's see. Jerk, DH-108 Swallow, no E frightening. Read clandestine operations. On the 5th December 1915, a H flotilla attacked the San Giovanni de Meda, which is Schengen, Albania today. Before the action, they landed some Albanian insurgents. Always fun. Any other similar books you'd recommend? To this one? Lots. His whole collection. Oh. Have we all guessed what aircraft I was talking about? That, by the way, on the front cover is a swallow. The Howland Swallow. The Howland Swallow. Black Widow. And the aircraft I've just been reading the description of was his test flight of the Saunders Roe SRA-1. You'll know. My favourite random aircraft to bring on people talking about jets. And there are some pretty darn cool pictures in here. This is one of the things. This book is full of very, very cool pictures. If anyone's interested in, I don't know, modelling, this book's also good for that, if you want to know the stories of things. Also, there are very few books in here, very few aircraft in here, which do not have pages like this, which are sort of some technical overview pages and various things. And they are done using his own pictures and the pictures he took. And that's one of the really cool things about this book, honestly. There's so much in here which is his own stuff. You feel like you could, after reading this, you do feel like you could fly the planes. How much would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? I presume a lot, seeing as Chuck would be part of their name. Breckenhennel, I don't expect the Empire test pilots were allowed to work abroad. Yes. Well, they did quite a lot. Rapid Raceback. He did a lot. You're asking that he did a lot of private work as a test pilot for various aviation companies, but the Western ones. So he went and flew for some American companies he was loaned out to them, all those things. Empire test pilots are well looked after. And he stayed in the Royal Navy and became a captain. You know, he did have a fairly good naval career. The only reason he didn't make admiral was because they started getting rid of carriers. And that's where they sort of stopped him getting higher. Anonymous. Flying boats are ugly, which makes them so lovable. I could accept that, but I would say also, don't take this wrong way, but the Black Widow here isn't exactly beautiful, and I'd say that's not lovable. Black Widow is an interesting story when you go through it in the book. Let me see if I can find the right page. Northrop Black Widow 219. To sum up, the Black Widow did not have the performance to be an operational success as a night fighter, but it was a completely docile aircraft with no really bad features to damn it, except perhaps one, shocking forward vision in rain due to the fact that the front windscreen panel was so far from the pilot's eyes that any mark came into focus and affected his view. Certainly, it was completely undeserving of the sinister name it bore. That is the other good thing. You do have these wonderful little summaries at the end. Let's see, Western Wyvern. Let's go for the summary. In the final reckoning, I was just about as impressed with the Wyvern as I was the Firebrand. That was not saying much, although one must concede that the Wyvern was a much more daring design that was plagued with development problems. Western Welkin. In summary, neither the British nor the German efforts to produce a twin-engined, high-altitude interceptor could be assessed as very impressive, but in my view, the Welkin would have been more of a chance of operational success than the Arado 240 above 30,000 feet. And then the Westland Whirlwind. It must be remembered that the Grumman Skyrocket, another good looker, was a failure but generated a successful Tiger Cat. However, the Western Welkin, undoubtedly inspired by the Whirlwind, failed to rise above mediocrity. He's always so polite. Rapid Razorback. The Black Widow is very effective, decent interdiction platform, and armed to the teeth. I'm not sure. I would say its operational performance actually backs up Brown's assessment of it, but I would still say it was the best aircraft they had available for the jobs at the time. Peter Dawson, is World War II fighter or helicopter? Fighter. Fighter. Rapareza, it's a British trait to be insulting in the nicest way possible. Honestly, that isn't always the case. Some of us just are insulting. Going elsewhere, Black Widow. At the end of May, the US Air Force insisted on competition between the Mosquito and the P-61 for Operation European Theatre. RAF crews flew the Mosquito Mark 17 to 17, while crews from the 422nd NFS flew the P-61. In the end, US Air Force determined that the P-61 had a slightly better rate of climb and could turn more tightly than the Mosquito. Don't take this the wrong way, Calvin Gasberg, but I'm not sure I trust that assessment. Jafila, what amazes me most about Winkle Brown is he's flying with German jets after World War II. Very unfamiliar handling, but he just gets in and flies them. Including the rocket one, which he just basically takes off and gets it away from the Russians before they can take it. Rapid Razorback, have any authors stumbled across this and sent you books to recommend? Pen and Sword send me their books, which is where the new books this week come from. They're all Pen and Sword ones, which have been sent to me to review. So, Gathering Storm. The trilogy, the first in the trilogy by Geirr Haarr, and well, these are just good works. Strained reserves. With fewer than 30 Atlantic U-boats available, a maximum of 8 to 10 was all that could be active in the vast sea room at any one time in 1939. Nowhere near sufficient to choke the British supply lines. To avoid having all the boats come back at the same time from the first patrol, clogging the bases while leaving the operating areas empty, the first boats were called back only a week after the outbreak of war, initiating a rotational system. By 20th of September, only 4 U-boats were left in the Atlantic, and rarely in the next 6 months would more than 6 to 8 boats be on patrol west of the British Isles at any one time. Conditions of war were demanding, and some of the boats coming back showed alarming signs of technical failures not seen during exercises or tests. Longer periods were spent at full head, both on diesel and electric engines. The boats dived deeper, more often, and above all, some had been exposed to depth charges. Engine mounts were loose, periscopes did not work properly, and there were leaks from the hatches and the valves. Engineering teams at the yards worked shifts to keep the boats in action, but the wear was significant, and neither the turnaround time nor the quality of the jobs were always to the liking of Donnets. The building of new boats and the training crews was also continued, but at a pace well below what Donnets had requested. New crews were assigned to boats still under completion, in order to familiarize them with each other and their future ship as fast as possible. Once a U-boat had been commissioned, acceptance trials were undertaken to check the engines and equipment, usually with several returns to the yards for adjustments and improvements. A rigorous operational training period followed, culminating with a spell at the front training group. When declared ready for war, some 6 to 8 weeks after commissioning, the boats were fitted out and sent on their first war patrol. The results obtained by the U-boats in 1939 and early 1940 may appear impressive, but in fact they were rather inconclusive. During the first 4 months of the war, 125 ships were sunk directly by U-boats, amounting to some 447,000 tons. By the 8th of April, a further 119 ships had been sunk for 367,000 tons. The number of sinkings per week went down once the convoy system had been fully established, and the successes were mainly gained against stragglers or merchant ships sailing independently. An increasing number of the latter were neutrals, with limited effect on British war effort. Many boats returned from long patrols without having sunk any merchant ships. During 1939, 9 U-boats were lost. On paper, this was favourable compared to the number of ships sunk, but the absolute number of U-boats and experienced crews was simply too low to sustain even these relatively moderate losses. Moreover, Donnis was losing his boats much faster than he was able to replace them. By the 8th of April, the number of boats lost had risen to 21, while he had only commissioned 7 new ones, 5 in 1939 and 2 in 1940. 15 of the U-boats lost were the Type 7 or Type 9 boats, as were 5 of the 7 new ones, making the net loss of Atlantic boats 10. For the whole of 1940, the estimate of new boats was 46, but the majority of these would not be commissioned before late in the year. The U-boat Waff was about to be decimated, and morale was falling. It's a good book. And as Rapid, I think Shulmax just said, Winkle Brown does get in a comet and just takes it off while Russians are actually shouting at him. Come on, guys, read Black Widow. Yeah, top speed goes to Mozzie. Do you know what I know? Which P61 are we talking? P61A, P61B, the Night Fighter variant? Probably the latter. I think that was the ones which made it to the Western theatre, to the European theatre. Hello, Blue Ship Butter. This is a very, very good book. It's a very good trilogy. It's a lovely series. And it's one of the interesting things in that there aren't many English source accounts published by a Norwegian author on the Norway campaign and on World War II. Geirr is one of the few. And the books are excellent. I have all 3, and I'm very happy to have all 3. Although currently in my possession I have 2 of them, because the 3rd one has been nicked. Hello, Mum. Growing up in a family of bibliophiles, you learn that the books will disappear and then they'll eventually reappear later. Fine, unharmed, but well read. Schumack, why the Germans couldn't win is summarised in those few sentences. That and a few other things. Before anyone's asked what's happened to my arms, 10-week-old corgi puppy, who's just been through having pneumonia, and a rather larger, fluffy research assistant who doesn't like being brushed. Not these scratches, I mean, no, but the he manages to keep trying to dodge the brush, and the brush sometimes ends up scratching me. Because we have to deal with the wool, you have to have a special type of brush, and it's... I wish there was a better one. But it does scratch your skin, something chronic, when you get caught. Mainly it's caught on this arm. But it does look kind of weird, because it looks like I've been in some sort of, I don't know. Well, if Drac and I have been testing out his sword collection. F-Ball Gnome. I'll have to add the trilogy to my list of books to read. It sounds very interesting. It is. Incredibly interesting. They're very good books. Money 1640. How much differently do you think things would have gone if Donitz had had the 300 seagoing boats he'd have asked for at the start? He'd have been able to put out roughly 50. He'd have probably started about. It's going to sound strange. He'd turn them into 6 watches of 50. But again, it depends on the proportion of boats, whether he has the longer range boats he's emphasizing by the end of the war, or the shorter range ones he's beginning and at the beginning of the war. The trouble is, if you build too many boats pre-war, the odds are they're going to be the shorter range ones in large numbers, which actually then can whilst you have more boats, you actually then have a far more limited area. And the trouble is, if you have the boats in the service, you're going to use them. But if you're using them, then it's harder for you to make the case for A, building them, and B, replacing them with longer range boats. You have to. It's not we have to build more submarines and I want to build these. It's we have to keep operating these submarines, pay for them, maintain them, keep them mooring, whilst also building more ones to replace them because they're not the submarines we actually need. It's a more difficult case to make. So, yeah, it's a case of if he'd had 300 U-boats at the beginning of the war, it would have been definitely more problematic. But there again. And this is the point that I often make. These things don't happen in a vacuum. So if Donitz had had 300 U-boats by 1939, he would have had to start building them probably well back in 1933 in large numbers to get anywhere near 300 U-boats. And massively large numbers. So large, the Royal Navy couldn't have failed to have noticed not just the Royal Navy, the British Foreign Office couldn't have failed to notice. The British Treasury would have had to seen them. As such, you would have probably found within about a year the Royal Navy would have started ramping up destroyer production and sloop production. Honestly, would have been ramping it up something chronic. And the thing is, the Royal Navy could always produce more sloops and more destroyers than the German Navy could produce submarines. So you'd have then had, yes, we've got more submarines, but the British would have probably had a far stronger convoy escort in World War II at the beginning than they had previously. And they had a fairly strong one at the beginning anyway. They knew what they needed to do. They just didn't have the ships for it, and they didn't have the ships for it in part because they were building for a balanced threat. Again, if you've got the Germans building just concentrating on submarines, you have to presume that if anything gets built, it's Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but does Bismarck and her sisters get built? Tirpitz, are they ordered? If you're building 300 submarines, maybe you get a third Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, maybe you get a third one with 15-inch guns, but I doubt you get a fourth one, and I doubt you get all that many ships. So you then have a problem that as far as Royal Navy is concerned, your threat is single-focused, and they can afford to focus on that. And you wouldn't also be surprised if... This is going to sound strange. If they think it's going to be an anti-submarine war, I wouldn't be surprised if the plans for a baby carrier get dusted off about 1937. So you might well find you've got some baby carriers in the water. Maybe escort carriers is sort of as we'd sort of understand them, but small carrier vessels for convoy escorts as quickly produced as possible. You might even have corvette production at the beginning, because remember, corvettes also do not happen in a vacuum. Rapid Razorback, I find it hysterical your mother takes off with your books. How does her? My sister nicks my historical engineering books. I mean, seriously, I have a copy of Vitruvius, which has disappeared again. Again, he wouldn't have had enough torpedoes for them either. Well, again, if you're building 300 submarines, you'd have to hope you do that. Oh. Don't worry, they're not holding my books hostage. Frankly, he wouldn't have, as I said, he would have had to build the torpedoes. But again, it's going to be a huge industry. Sure, Mike, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The Iron would have had far more escorts, and they would have invested in CVs rather than buying US ones. To be honest, they buy Canadian ones as much as US ones. Well, there are all sorts of things that would have been done. Anonymous, 1939 to 1940, U-boats can't win because no French or even Norwegian bases and plenty of French ships for ASW. That's the other thing. If you have the Royal Navy have invested in far more in destroyers and sloops in the 1930s in response to the German build-up of submarines, Norway campaign again might also be different because you'd have far more destroyers on call to saturate Norway. Ujibura, 79 years ago today, the Japanese fleet, including 6 aircraft carriers, approached the Hawaiian Islands, making final preparation for their sneak attack on the US Pacific Fleet. Yep. The Canadian government would have had to pay attention if Donitz had gotten his 300 U-boats. Yes, pretty much the amount of people who would have had to start waking up and going, "Excuse me, what's going on?" Gemma, would all that mean very bloody 1939 to 1940 ASW war in North Sea, with losses on both sides and a lot of mines? Yes, and yes. The Royal Navy would have reacted. It's one of those great things when you're doing what if history, because so often the predilection of people is to go, so if this side changes this one thing, how does this change the whole war? You can't do that, because if they change it in time to do it, you can't just magically appear 300 submarines. If you're building up to 300 submarines, well, A, the Navy in the world which has the most submarines is going to start reacting. That's the Royal Navy at this time. B, the American Navy is going to react. Everyone's going to react. Because if you start reacting with your 300 submarines, the Royal Navy is going to terminate the treaty. Probably the London Treaty, and going to go, well, you either need to give us permission to build a lot more destroyers, or we are going to build a whole class of S-sloops, which are anti-submarine warfare sloops, and we're going to pump them out like something chronic. And again, if you consider the whole sloop designation, 20 knots, up to 2,000 tons, no designed for speed greater than 20 knots, and up to 2,000 tons, that's a long-range anti-submarine warfare escort. That is what, and it's no wonder the Black Swans started getting built. So what you'd have had is you'd had the Black Swans, maybe slightly bigger versions of the Black Swans, being built earlier, and the Royal Navy would have got turned around to people and gone, they don't carry torpedoes, they don't have guns over the specification, they're not designed for a greater than 20 knots, we can build as many as we like. And you can imagine the American and Japanese reaction to that. So that is what would have happened. The Royal Navy would have been pumping out sloops chronically, and I'm talking about every year. For every destroyer that's produced, a sloop would have been entering service. Pedler, are there any good biographies on Stephenson? I keep hearing you talk about him. Seems an interesting character to learn about. Not yet. I think I'm going to have to write it. I have friend. Do you reckon me consider doing a joint one on him? I have no doubt that if the Germans had built 300 submarines in Soviet Russia, that would have also caused response. Again, do you think Britain... It's like if Italy had built enough submarines, or let's say Germany built 100 submarines, Soviet Russia built 100 submarines, and Italy built 100 submarines. And their plan was to hand them all over to Germany to operate. That would have caused a response from Britain, because Britain would have gone, have you seen Soviet Russia? Have you seen all these ones? Remember that Doctor's mother is like Wallowitz, mother on Big Square 3. Often talked about, but never seen. You'll probably see her in time. My sister occasionally pops up with a puppy dog. Right. So, as we're sort of talking about submarines, going to the first of new books. And it's 0108. Right then. So, first of the brand new books, and this was sent to me by Pen and Sword to review, and it's lovely. It's U-Boats at War in 100 Objects, and it's by Gordon Williams. And to be honest, it came with another book, which is also very lovely. Before we get into it, let's answer some quick questions. I will write it on the Henderson book. I will write the Henderson book. BFW, hello. Is there a set of studies or books that points to the reasons the Royal Navy moved away from Calabar to Stubble in the 70s and 80s? Not really. be honest, Norman Freeman's British Carrier Aviation is the best one for covering that. But basically, the reason is lots of people get focused on the Central Front and on Central Europe. Yes, please, write it, King. Canada and India can build sloops. They can. They can be built anywhere in the Empire, so they could have had sloop production going in Australia. The Royal Navy probably been building 2 flotillas of sloops, but they'd also had a flotilla being built a year in India, and a flotilla being built a year in Australia, a flotilla being built a year in Canada, maybe even a flotilla being built a year in South Africa. So, honestly, I can't imagine something worse for the Germans to do strategically than to actually have been building up to 300 submarines prior to World War II. Because you would have a Royal Navy unfettered by the problems of war, able to build as many sloops as it wanted. And sloops are far more dangerous than corvettes. Because remember, whilst they have to be designed for a speed no greater than 20 knots, they actually can often go faster than 20 knots. They often have far more structural integrity. They're built to naval standards. Far more than a corvette is. They are far more, and they would be, those crews would be worked up far more longer. And it takes less time, so you can add on more experience to anti-submarine warfare crews than you can to submarine crews. Because when it goes wrong in a submarine, you tend to not get anyone back. When it goes wrong in a sloop or a destroyer, usually that's a bad day at office, and the worst thing is they're going to need is a tow. Italians built good submarines. Sorry, Anonymous, they did actually. They were actually fairly good submarines, but the trouble is where they were based. Italians were desperate for export orders in the 30s. So, Germany could have ordered them there, yes. Just B. Wings of the Weird and Wonderful. Version 1 that starts at £86.13. US Amazon. I think this... This is produced by Hikoki Publications. Hikoki Publications. And it was, when it was brand new, was sold at UK £34, USA $56.95. It's got a price inside it. Jeff Ealer, then the Michael Clapp book. Michael Clapp is a mod. Don't worry. We've got Michael Clapp and Julian Thompson coming on this week to record for Bilge Pump's Christmas special. You're going to enjoy it. So, this book does U-boat warfare through 100 objects. And it talks about all the things of Eric radar, basic training, a Type 2 U-boat. Actually, we'll do the Type 2 U-boat. And just over 40 meters long and displacing between 250 and 314 tons, the Type 2 was known as the Einbahn, or dugout canoe, due to its diminutive size. The crew consisted of 3 officers and 22 men, and the boat carried just 6 torpedoes. By the outbreak of war, although it was already outclassed by the Type 7, that would become the backbone of the U-boat WAF in the Second World War, it did fill an important role in the early part of the war, and indeed some served up until 1944 in the Black Sea, whilst others operated as training boats. It was nevertheless of historical significance, having been designed by the Dutch firm NV Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw. Sorry, my Dutch is terrible. A fake company set up by the Germans in the Netherlands to circumvent the prohibition on Germany producing submarines. Despite its diminutive size, limited range, and limited armament, the Type 2 served with some considerable success in coastal waters in the early part of the war, with some of the great U-boat aces gaining some of their early victories in the Type 2. be a Type 2 that would achieve the distinction of being the first submarine to sink another submarine. Most of the Type 2 variants served during the invasion of Norway, and thereafter very gradually released for training duty as many more Type 7s became available. Well over 150 war cruises had been undertaken, and in excess of 100 enemy vessels sunk by these small vessels. 6 Type 2Bs were dispatched to the Black Sea for operations against Soviet ships. Because of their small size, it was decided to partially dismantle them and send them via inland waterways and then overland. When the tide of war turned against Germany on the Eastern Front, it was no longer possible to return these boats via the same route as they had arrived, and they were eventually scuttled to prevent them falling into enemy hands. The most advanced version was the Type 2D, of which 16 were built. Many were sent directly to training units, but those that saw combat completed a total of 36 war cruises, sinking 27 enemy ships, a total that included 3 warships. Despite the small number built, only 50 of all variants, and the limited combat capabilities, the Type 2s were the vessels around which Germany's first U-boat flotillas were created, and in many ways were the foundation of the U-boat fleet, as they were the U-boats. They were the ships of as they were the U-boats where the aces learnt their craft. It's a lovely put together book. It's just so cool. It's well put together. It's well published. It's beautiful pages. It's beautiful pictography. It's got everything you could want to have. It's kind of, again, if you've got someone who might be interested in submarine warfare, might not be, this is like the Dog Boats of War book. It is individual chapters which you can read as a whole book and really enjoy it as a whole book, but you can also read a chapter, dive in, dive out, find bits you like. It's a good book. Raparese, is there an American version of Henderson? There are a few officers who fulfill the sort of American role of Henderson because it's kind of more designed, because of the American bureau system and the way they run the structure, it's sort of broken up more, whereas Henderson has quite such autocratic power in many ways as Third Sea Lord. Then the Michael Clapp book. Yeah, maybe. Calm Gasbook. I know you're making a joke about the Australian-Hungarian Empire and saying they could have surprise built multiple submarines. I would actually say there was actually a navy which could have surprise built submarines if it had wanted to, and that was the Royal Navy, and there is a reason for that. Most of the major yards in Britain had subsidiaries around the empire in various places, and whilst I would love to say Britain is an open book, a free society, there are enough restrictions going around it in the 1930s in its various empire and colonies that if you'd wanted to start building some ships, not a large number, but you wanted to build some more to give Britain a bit of an advantage in any coming war, you could have probably got away with it. Rapid Raceback. Michael Clapp is still alive. He can write his own book. I suspect he may be too humble to do it. That is one of the issues. He's written his book about the Falklands War, Amphibious Assault Falklands, which is a very, very good book. If you haven't heard it or seen it, I have an original copy. Very, very battered. There is newer versions available, which are produced by Pen and Sword. And this has got all Michael Clapp stuff in it. We were also told that no orders would be given for a breakout from the beachhead until after the arrival of a second brigade, for which CTF was arguing strongly, but which, as we now know, was the subject of much procrastination. This suggested that no move from the beachhead would be ordered, other than patrolling and raiding, until that second brigade, if it was to materialise, was in situ. Certainly the expression "plan to land on the Falklands Islands with a view to repossession" indicated this, and if it didn't turn up, as we listened aboard HMS Hermes to the North Sea ferry MV Norland was being requisitioned in Hull, with a party from the Royal Navy and 2 para on their way to join her. She would be fitted with landing spots for 2 Sea Kings and equipped for replenishing at sea, and would sail at midday on 26th of April, with 840 paratroopers embarked. The next day, the Europic ferry, Captain C.J. Clark, was also to be taken up from trade to carry the battalion's heavy equipment and vehicles. She would sail on the 28th. Julian and I were given little opportunity to speak, but when we did so, we reiterated our need for Intrepid and more helicopters, all along stressing the necessity of air superiority. But I was left with the firm impression that these requests were politically unacceptable, and that we were perhaps not senior enough in the chain to make such fundamental requests, not for those requests to warrant much attention. This was the country's most serious military international crisis for many years, and a critical part of it was about to be prosecuted by 2 rather junior officers. A fact that probably rankled with some back home. We had the feeling that we would just be told to get on with it, with the tools that only they felt were necessary. I could not help noticing that my admiral, Derek Raffel, was not present, as he would, hopefully, have lent weight to my needs. His absence also suggested that he would not be in the command chain. I was to learn after the victory that he had in fact been refused access to Northwood, where he had tried to offer his amphibious experience, as he could see the things that were not moving along lines of normal practice, and he had wanted to lend Julian and me his support. We argued our case for staying at Ascension Island to complete training and restowing, stating all the while that we were anxious not to sail until the enhanced commander brigade was together. We were not keen to embark for uncertainties on the Southern Ocean until ready in all respects for war. For some, this appears to have been seen as pussyfooting, but to us, who would have to carry out the operation, these preparations were vital, as though to emphasize our perceived position on the command chain, I found it extremely difficult to have an interview with the CTF. I did finally manage it in the presence of Jeremy Reed, the fleet warfare officer, when I asked for clarification of the command structure. CTF assured me that I was not and would not be operating under Sandy, and that we would be totally separate when the amphibious phase came. Sandy would be required to support the amphibious task force and to react to its needs, all be carried out in accordance with ATP-8, and that was good enough for me. Landing with our numerical inferiority would only be feasible if we were loaded correctly, chose the beaches carefully based on good intelligence, and possessed air superiority. Any advance to combat against a forecast, even at the time, of over 10,000 troops would require a firm logistics base ashore, and the doubling, at the very least, of our own numbers. 3-1 is the accepted norm for attacking force, but Julian's men, as they then stood, would be outnumbered by the same ratio. With a second brigade, we would be closer to matching the required numbers, if not actually having the advantage. Number matching, though, can lead to the false pictures for so many men are not combat troops, and we suspected in this case that those who were largely conscripts of were largely conscripts of doubtful quality. This should not be seen as over-optimism on our part, but I knew that Julian's enlarged commander brigade contained the best. Although outnumbered, but with the support they hoped they would have on call by the time they were ready to move out of the beachhead, they should, in his own words, hack it, and hack it all the way to Stanley if required. Anonymous. No one knew at the start of the war what the optimal submarine was. This is why you have Surkov, UK, and IJN submarines with aircraft. This is why you have lots of things. This is another reason why I find it who will go. They would have had 300 submarines. Which submarines? Shumak, are you implying the British methods they could use to work around the treaty system? If anyone could, they could. They're the ones who wrote the treaties, after all. Sun Kits, looking forward to the next Bill Trumps. Really enjoyed my Collapse book. Your recommendation. I'm glad you did. That was what I was just reading from. Anonymous. My dictionary has perfidious right before prudent. Yes, and perfidious Albion is a long-running trend. Carmen Gaswood. All KUK sub in 1914 were CCA 300 tons submerged, but they made in 1908 and 1909. Jeff Elam, I think the RCN does have a Henderson. We are building more Type 26s than any other country. They will be working around the world showing flags. Supply ships. De Wolf's Arctic patrolling. Yep. I think I can understand, and honestly, it makes sense. You see, you have to remember, when you're looking at the Royal Navy and you're going, yes, they're not building as many Type 26 as the Canadians. So don't go, well, the Royal Navy also has the Type 45s. And they're going to have the Type 31s and the Type 32s. So that's the reason why they're not building as many Type 26s, because for the Canadians, it's basically one-stop shop. This is our surface combatant. Whereas for the RN, the Type 26 is one of their surface combatants. And it makes a slight difference, but I still would like more. As I said, I would like 12. Carmen, bought 2 books today on a car boot. Posted on Discord. Oh, cool. Rapid Razor. Britain would never break a treaty that would be nefarious and unbecoming. They would express an intent to comply with the treaty. The violation would be a misunderstanding of treaty language. No, it would be a very careful reading of treaty language and working out exactly how wide the loophole is. And whether or not, if they exploited enough, they could make Admiral King's blood pressure rise to the point at which he has a full cardiac arrest. Or whoever's in Admiral King's boat when they find out about it. So, Thompson, let's look up. Hello, Gino11. Can't stay long as I'm on data due to the internet company saying pay up, saying when no, it's next week. That's annoying. Hello, Thompson. At least here in Canada, Falklands isn't really taught. Do you think it's because we were focused on peacekeeping at the time, or just the void being created by Trudeau and the... so many issues going on there. You ask which submarines. I thought that was sacrificed in the seagoing part, which excludes Type 2s. Type 2s and even Type 7s is questionable if they qualify. Type 9s certainly are seagoing too. Well, the trouble is, again, it's going to sound strange, but the Germans can more... If you're starting construction, though, back in 1933, to get up to 300 boats by 1939... What designs do you have available in 1933 you can start mass producing? That's the problem. The odds are it's going to be Type 2s and Type 7s. Type 2s for the inshore work and Type 7s. Type 9s come along comparatively late in that process. And they would still require quite a lot of development to get them there. So, yes, I can... yes, I can see the point being made that if they're trying to do this, they would be building probably better submarines. But also there's the fact that look at the designs they have available when they start building them. Strub, Doctor, do you think the UK military had to learn lessons of the Falklands War the US learned in Vietnam, aka politics trying to do tactics? Oh. The British military learns it very regularly and then over and over again. I'll be back in a second. It's been a lot of editing today, and this may again be my second bottle. Hey, caramba. Oh, wait. No. Aye. Oh, God, that was painful. Oh. Lots of books falling over. Lots and lots of books falling over. Hello. Right. Let's see. There's nothing touchy about it. About the Falklands War. We all have different things. Also, you have to remember the Falklands War is a maritime conflict. And for lots of countries, that just wasn't something they were considering was going to happen. Maritime wars have been over for a long, long time, and suddenly people are going, ooh, they're coming back again. Oh, that's good. Space and speed. Jermac, Royal Navy, making both friends and enemies, blood pressure so high it would be dangerous for ship boilers. Yeah. Battler, what do you think the T-32s will look like? T-31 Batch 2s or another platform with a competition between Babcock, BMT, and BAE? If they truly want to make them cheap and numerous, it's going to be a T-31 modified. Only 1640. What about, and I know this would never happen with who's in charge, starting the war later than 1939? That, again, makes a big difference. If you're starting the war later than 1939, yes, you can build up. But also, you have to remember that the other services of the nations are building up as well. Every year you move that war later, more brand new Royal Navy aircraft carriers come online. Brand new, more Royal Navy destroyers. The treaty system has basically, because of Japan withdrawing from it, has ceased to exist in 1939. It ceased to exist in 1938, pragmatically, and has been de facto not working since 1937. So the longer you go without war, the more modern ships start to appear. So you're talking about the Tiger class, you're talking about the King George V, you're talking about various aircraft carriers getting in the Service Royal Navy, and you're talking about a huge number of destroyers and corvettes. Remember, the Royal Navy orders corvettes, i.e. the Flower class. In 1938, they start placing orders for them, I think. Memory? I covered this in my book. I think it was either late 1938 or early 1939. But they have been placed orders for them well before World War II actually begins. So they would have been called sloops. Or maybe they'd have been called corvettes, we're not quite sure, if they'd entered entered service in peacetime, but they were already ordered. So you cannot emphasize this more. The British Empire has a lot of industrial capacity. Yes, the Americans do. Yes, World War II Germany does. But actually, when you look at it and put it down to brass tacks, the British was warming up behind the Germans, but the British could surpass the Germans because of, in many ways, the legacies of empire. Dunragan, how late would the war have to start to get for the latest alliance to get made? 1943, probably. Yowza. Military, that's not an idiot. That's this is the whole point, which we cover a lot in bilge pumps and various other things. It's context. People focus so much, and this is one of the reasons I get into Singtals often. Honestly, if you have it go on longer, the odds are war starts in 1941. and it starts in the Far East. Because if you consider Tsingtao happens in 1939, all sorts of incidents happen between there and yes, you wouldn't have the Assamamar incident because you wouldn't have had war in Europe going on in 1940, but you would have probably still had another incident between the Japanese and the Royal Navy in 1940. There would have been an incident in 1941. World War II would have probably started in 1941 in the Far East. And then you have all those contingencies which me and Dan Freeman talked about. So, Thompson, Dr. Clark, do you see another run of OPVs, or do you think that the sloop will make a proper return? I wouldn't be surprised if there's another run of OPVs. I have this feeling. That there could be. Okay, I'm now going to do the difficult book. Because there is one book in new books which I have issues with. Now, as you all know, my normal policy when I don't like books, for whatever reason, is I just don't mention them. They just don't come up. I don't bring them up in brew ships. I don't bring them up in 4 random books. They're just not part of it. But the trouble is, when you're being sent books to review by publishers, you have. It's one of the things is you actually do have to write a review or give a review of them, or you send them back. And sometimes you get a book which is difficult because it has great content, some really great research, and some really great sourcing, and some wonderful quotes in it. And so that's really good. But you fundamentally, on an almost bone deep level, disagree with the analysis. And you have to make sure that doesn't cover your, or that doesn't detract from your review, and that doesn't color your review, i.e. you don't declare everything's bad because you disagree with the analysis. This is such one of those books, and actually it upsets me because it was the one I was most looking forward to. It's the Eastern Fleet and the Indian Ocean, 1942 to 1944. The Fleet That Had to Hide by Charles Stephenson. Now, I hadn't really read any of Charles's books before this. I'm not sure if after it I would look for them. If I can't send them to the review, I'd review them honestly like I'm doing now. As I've said, it does use some very interesting sources. It does do some very detailed work. But my problem started when I read the foreword by Commander Daniel Clark, OBE, RN, retired. Though I'm delighted to have been asked to contribute to this foreword to it, Charles Stevens' book is, in one sense, a rather depressing read. It charts the relegation of service from preeminence following the First World War to the realization that in Battlefleet terms it had fallen to second or even third place during the Second. Stephenson chronicles the several strands, political, technological, and doctrinal, that led to this decline, which only became fully revealed in 1942. Then the Eastern Fleet, the largest fleet deployed by the Navy during the Second World War up to 1945, was compelled to decline battle with its enemy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, and hide, more or less. This course was forced upon the fleet because it couldn't compete with the enemy tactically. Since strategic success depends upon achieving operational success, which in turn results from tactical successes, this had the potential for disaster. That this potential was mitigated to a large extent was due to the strategic imbecility, as Samuel Eliot Morison put it, of Japan simultaneously deciding to make an enemy of the United States of America. Because of this incalculable error, the Eastern Fleet was able to survive as a fleet in being. As the author states it, however, whilst discretion may well be the better part of valor, it rarely brings victory, and though it may exercise a deterrent, neither does a fleet in being. On the other hand, the story is ultimately a stirring one. Despite the incredible disadvantages and difficulties under which they laboured, the officers and men of the Eastern Fleet, under the inspiring command of Admiral Somerville, not only survived, but sprang back. Indeed, they held in check an enemy submarine campaign before, in 1944, being able to take large-scale offensive action against the enemy. Ultimately, the Eastern Fleet segued into the British Pacific Fleet and successfully participated in the final actions against Japan alongside the, by now, much larger American fleet. Stevenson's tale thus provides a happy ending, more or less. As he puts it, in the League of Table of Offensive Naval Power, the British now came a definite second, and that only because the new holder of the top spot had destroyed the only known contender. Quite so. There are, I think, large lessons to be learned from this relatively little-known story. Politicians and, yes, senior service commanders need to ensure that they match a means of ends. Indeed, they have a bounden duty to do so. Even the best-crafted strategy will end up trashed, unless those sent into harm's way to deliver it have a reasonable chance of dealing with whatever they might encounter. Neglecting this timeless principle inevitably results in failure and the expenditure of much blood, and the latter particularly is unforgivable. Sadly, as any study of relatively recent history, recent events will serve to demonstrate, it is a principle more often honoured in the breach than in observance. Okay. Right then. So 2 points. One, the Royal Navy was fighting in the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific at the same time. Two, it's part of the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal New Zealand Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, all need to be included in that grouping, because the Commonwealth were treated as one navy during the interwar years. Three, and this is a big point here, the American Navy was able to concentrate on the Pacific because the Royal Navy was concentrating on the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. So yes, the Royal Navy couldn't send its whole fleet, which was actually larger and slightly more powerful than the Japanese, to the Indian Ocean. I'm sorry. It's also fighting the Regia Marina, and it's fighting the Kriegsmarine. In the nicest way, that doesn't seem like it's shifted down to third or fourth place. I understand. There is a very strict narrative which comes through, which is that Britain's destroyed by World War II, la-di-da-di-da, we were terrible, da-da-da-da-da, and everything else since has been building up again and rebuilding or dealing with our changing place in the world. Actually, that more comes down to the Suez Crisis, but we'll leave that to one side. The fact is, when you start off writing like that and going, just because the British Pacific Fleet isn't able to outmass the Japanese Navy, the Royal Navy is now in third place, misses the whole point. The Royal Navy, at the same time in 1942, is doing all sorts of convoys in the Mediterranean, is fighting in the Arctic, is fighting in the North Atlantic, has cruisers patrolling the whole world. It is not a simple, easy matter. So saying this Navy is now, terrible, third place, fourth place, is missing a long point. There's also the fact that actually the US Navy doesn't start outmass the Royal Navy till 1946. We'll leave that to one side. It's just... So I have problems with the forward. And as you can see, there are actual bookmarks in here to make sure I go to sections, because I knew I was going to read forward and I knew I was going to be a bit annoyed about that. I wanted to make sure I went to sections which I could be very positive about, because unfortunately a lot of it does go with the forward and does follow that narrative. The trouble is that the fleet I now have to have is much bigger than anything anyone has had to handle before during this war. On top of that, most of my staff are pretty green, so I have to supervise almost everything myself. It will improve as time goes on, but it certainly is the devil of the job at present. That's Admiral Somerville talking about his staff officers. A bit of a micromanager. Reinforcement force A, in the form of the heavy cruiser Dorsetshire, which cut short her refit Colombo, arrived in the afternoon. That evening, the operation of the previous night was repeated, with a sweep to the northeast, although keeping clear of the areas already traversed. Cornwallis aboard Indomitable at this time later wrote, "The albacores on the Indomitable and Formidable were capable, if inadequate at the practice, in the execution of a night torpedo attack. There was a full moon on the 1st of April, so there seemed to be a reasonable chance of success if you were given the chance. The swordfish on Hermes were not fitted with ASV, that's air surface radar. Being part of Force B, we saw a little of her. However, when the sun rose a second, we were back again in the same position, steaming slowly west. Where were all these Japanese? Was all we could say to each other. Someone was asking the same question. As he put it to his wife, still no news of the enemy. I fear they have taken fright with it, which is a pity, because if I could have given them a good crack now, it would have been very timely. Unfortunately, I can't hang about indefinitely for them." This book does have some wonderful maps in it. It does have wonderful quotes, as I said, and some lovely pictures. It is, well, I don't know, not pictures. It does have a couple of good pictures, but mostly it's maps. Yeah. Winston has compared northern Sumatra to the Dardanelles, and did so proudly. The analogy may well be correct. A tempting objective that glittered so brightly that it was attempted without adequate resources, and therefore failed. In fact, a typical Winstonian project. Churchill famously once said, "I have not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." Yet he knew all was not well, particularly with the jewel in the crown. Nevertheless, he remained defiant and an avowed imperialist, determined to fight for the continuation of the empire. He certainly fought with the Chief of Staffs over preserving the attack on Sumatra, in particular, and the liberation of British territory generally. Brooke's diary entry for 25th February shows the extent of the difference of opinion. "I'm quite exhausted after 7.5 hours of Winston today, and most of the time engaged in heavy argument. At 12 noon, the Chiefs of Staff met the PM, and were kept till 1:45 p.m. He was still insistent on doing the North Sumatra operation, and would not discuss any other. I had a series of heated discussions with him. Then a hurried lunch, and at 3 p.m. we met again. This time he had packed the house against us, and was accompanied by Anthony Eden, Oliver Littleton, and Attlee. In addition, the whole of Dicky Mountbatten's Army, Naval, and Air Force officers. The whole party was against the Chief of Staff. Dicky chipped in and talked unadulterated nonsense, and I lost my temper with him. It was a desperate meeting, with no opportunity of discussing strategy on its merits. Thank God, I have now got Andrew Cunningham to support me. It makes all the difference in the days of poor old Dudley Pound. We argued from 3 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. I got very heated at times. Winston pretended that this was all a frame-up against his pet Sumatra operation, and almost took it as a personal matter. This book has some great strategy in it, and some great content. But as I said, from the forward onwards, some of the analysis, I suppose its best defense is it's a traditional analysis. It's a traditional perspective. I'm not sure if it's correct. I really don't agree with it being correct. No, it's not. but I'm not going to be more rude than that. Hmm. If you're talking about Far Eastern Royal Navy books about the Royal Navy in the Far East, Boyd's book, Navy in Eastern Waters, is better. In fact, yes, it is better. I would go with Boyd's book over that one. I can't see Boyd's book around me now. That's helpful. It was somewhere here earlier. King's Rook. Okay, this is sounding like a very bad forward. I understand Canada was a major power in 1945, but my question for the Doctor was, who was the best prepared for World War II? The best prepared of all the powers in 1939 was probably Britain, but the trouble is Britain was also the most spread out, and it wasn't sure where war was going to begin. Eric Oken, in Norway, there is a big debate now about history writing and correct use of sources. In short, it was discovered that the author had appended details not in the source. Well, there is sometimes there's a practice of using multiple sources to back up a certain point, so it's called a synthesized reference when you use multiple sources, but you have to point out you've used all those different sources. I must be deaf lazy. Did the author? That was the foreword that complained that. So the 5-5-3 ratio was the worst thing that happened to the RN. If they'd been able to get to maintain a great numbers advantage in both amount and slight weight premium, that would have worked ideal. It would have been, but that wasn't it. Hello, Gordon Collins. Did. Joseph, is there a good book discussing how the various navies gained the interwar navy treaties or just ignore them? There are the John Jordan series of warships after Washington and warships after London, but I would say that he does consider the Royal Navy far more law-abiding and spirit-obeying than I necessarily do. That's the Warships After London by John Jordan. Captain Stephenson, do you think there's an argument to be made about in the principle that books one disagrees with are the most important as they make one think about why they're wrong? Yes. That's right. One thing that really irritates me is that I'm guessing the author does not really look at the... he goes into... yeah. Yeah. Or what I tend to do is go on and write a better book myself. Um, it's the old thing is it's a very simple case to make, and I can understand if you take the Eastern Fleet on its own, just look at the ships there. Yes, the Royal Navy's outnumbered, but then you have to consider the Royal Navy supplying Force H, the Mediterranean Fleet, the Eastern Fleet, the Home Fleet. That's quite a lot of forces. And then people go, well, then get massive for the British Pacific Fleet. Well, then when the Royal Navy's putting the British Pacific Fleet together, they still have an Indian Ocean Fleet, an Eastern Fleet, but they no longer really have a Mediterranean Fleet in terms of capital units. They don't have Force H. They have very few capital units in the Home Fleet. They don't need to. They can afford to send the carriers out there. And it's total tonnage and all sorts of things. That's the figure till 1946. So you have to remember the Royal Navy builds quite a huge, tremendously huge tonnage of escorts and all sorts of things. And whilst the US Navy does end up taking over in 1946, that's mostly because the Royal Navy is cutting down, and the US Navy, all those things they've ordered, which make their big number headlines, and they build all these carriers and all these things, quite a lot of them start entering service actually in 1946, by the time they're actually properly commissioned into service. Shrub, Doctor, what one class of ship had the greatest impact on World War II? Or what class would have been most missed? Flag class corvettes. Bygone, let's see. So, next one. Trafalgar Chronicles. It's a fun and good book. Avian Enterprise, I would say Liberty ships. Well, then you have to technically go Liberty and Victory ships, because there are the Victory ships produced in Canada, same time as Liberty ships are being produced in the USA. You go to war the enemy you have, not the enemy you want. That is true. That is very true. So, Trafalgar Chronicles. And it's a very cool series. This is number 5 in the series. Got some great pictures in it. It's got a great list of authors, and its topics in this particular version include representations of Horatio Nelson in the visual arts, Nelson in caricature and cartoon, Tobias Smollett and the early Georgian Navy, Beyond Labour Barbara, women as portrayed in British naval fiction, Vice Admiral Thomas Fremantle's protege, Charles Fremantle. Written by Charles Fremantle, it's about Sir Andrew Pellet Green. Commander Sir James Pearl, Captain John Halton Marshall, and Captain Ralph Willett Miller. Even has articles of general interest, and I'm going to read from one of these. A Second Naval War. In the immediate effects of... Let's see. No. Don't want to read that one. No, this one's more fun. Cornwallis, A Woman Named Cuba and the Caribbean. Written by Barry Jolly. It is a matter of naval folklore that in 1781, Horatio Nelson, then a junior captain serving in the West Indies, was nursed back to health from a life-threatening condition by a Jamaican nurse. He then returned home to Britain in the third-rate HMS Leon, 64, commanded by captain by William Cornwallis, a captain many years his senior. Nelson himself was in no doubt as to where the credit lay, writing Cornwallis many years later, "I never shall forget that to you I probably owe my life," going on to say, "and I feel that I'm imbibed from you certain sentiments which have greatly assisted me in my naval career. That we could always beat a Frenchman if he fought him long enough. That the difficulty of getting at them was oftentimes more people's own fancy than from the difficulty of the undertaking. That people did not know what they could do until they tried, and it was always to err on the right side to fight." Well, question. Nelson's own extraordinary self-regard did not prevent him from having the highest personal and professional respect for Cornwallis. Cornwallis himself remains a much underappreciated admiral, his most significant contribution to Britain's security during a lifetime of distinguished service being his maintenance of the blockade of Brest through unusually ferocious winters in 1801 and from 1803 to 1806. The blockade may have lacked the cachet of various victorious fleet actions, but it was undoubtedly equally notable. Nonetheless, in July 2019, the 1805 Club and the Milford-on-Sea Historical Record Society took steps to restore his standing on the occasion of the bicentenary of his death. Memorial service in Milford-on-Sea, an exhibition at St. Barb Museum and Art Gallery in Lymington, and an article in Hampshire Studies all contributed to an overdue appraisal. The evidence of suggestions of less than decorous conduct on the part of Cornwallis is therefore worthy of consideration. This article analysed the claims that Admiral Sir William Cornwallis had a number of illegitimate children in Jamaica and established the true nature of his relationship with a supposed slave, Cuba. Most military and naval memoirs are written by senior officers detailing the successes or exploits. Rather less usual, and even less so 200 years ago, are recollection of sailors from the lower deck. One such, however, was written by William Richardson, and his comments on Admiral William Cornwallis are striking. The image of Cornwallis in retirement, in happy domesticity with Mrs. Whitby, the widow of his almost perennial flag captain John Whitby, his horses and his parrots, has long been accepted. So too his religious faith, the devotion to care and duty and care for his men. The idea that he could have been a wild fellow sits uncomfortably with his reputation as a staid and sober admiral of renown. Yet that is how he was depicted by Richardson in his memoirs, published many years after his death. Richardson's experience coincided with the accepted image of moderation. He described how on day 24th April 1794, when Cornwallis returned to Britain after nearly 5 years in India, the admiral espied two wherries carrying girls approaching. Becoming more agitated, he sent for Captain Whitby and desired him to not allow any such creatures to come near the ship. Once he had gone ashore, Whitby, the son of a vicar, nevertheless allowed his crew the welcome company of the young ladies. Richardson went on to comment, "It was very strange that the admiral, a religious and good man, could not bear the sight of a female, and yet he had been very much among them in his youthful days, and was called a wild fellow. It was reported on board that, as a fact, that he once went on ashore to dine with the governor at Madras, and as some ladies began to take their seats at the table while he was there, he arose, took up his hat, and left the company, to the astonishment of them all, and came aboard. The absence of any supporting evidence, any exuberance or unbecoming conduct by young Cornwallis, has been overlooked by historians. However, in 2006, a book on the Cornwallis family by Reverend N.B. Cryer was published, with detailed information suggesting that Cornwallis had indeed sown some wild oats in his younger days. The evidence is limited to some names, with dates over several decades relating to events in Jamaica. They raise some interesting questions about the way Cornwallis spent his youth. Cryer set out the following claims. The Honourable William Cornwallis, R.N., fathered the following children. By Elizabeth Spencer, a free negress, born in 1745, buried 13th of the 12th, 1808. A free mulatto, born 14th 10th, 1761, baptised 1st of the 1st, 1783, James Cornwallis, M. Elizabeth. Marcella Elizabeth Cornwallis, baptised 5th of the 1st, 1780. Charlotte Goldston Cornwallis, born 18th of the 9th, 81, baptised 6th of the 12th, 81, and buried 10th of the 8th, 83. Priscilla Elizabeth Cornwallis, born 24th of the 1st, 91, baptised 23rd of the 10th, 91, buried 1st, 11th, 1816. So, in her case, she got to 25 years old. By Anne Arnott, buried 8th of the 10th, 1777. Harry, born 17th of the 10th, 1684, baptised 17th of the 2nd, 65. William, born 25th of the 12th, 65, baptised 14th of the 3rd, 66, buried 20th of the 6th, 66. By Cuta, or Cuba, James Cornwallis, free man of colour, born 26th of the 10th, 71, baptised 11th of the 10th, 72, buried 16th of the 5th, 1812. Married Jane, or Johanna Smith, a free woman of colour. And apologies. But that's the census records, as they were. Cryer's genealogical information is correct in terms of the various names, thereby confirming that Cornwallis did indeed father a number of children in Jamaica. But there are a number of inaccuracies in Cryer's account, together with shallow analysis and unsupported conclusions. A more accurate account is set out here, albeit allowing for some uncertainties that cannot be resolved at this distance in time. It's a cool one. It's a good book, but I do admit it's more of an academic book, but it is still a good book. Let's see. Melly 16 morning. I thought Victory ships were the turbine-powered version. They were the Canadian British version. So they came in about the same time as Liberty ships. Trent Lanko. Why, when IJN kicked off World War II, every single ship was in operation, and not a single ship unit was in refit. This was a 110% effort that was going to fall apart after a year, simply because the IJN would burn through all its spares and power plant life at wartime usage rates. Yes. Hello, Yogi Khan. Doctor, given a change in doctrine, could Japan operate a commerce raider force and tie up more escorts in the Pacific? They could have done. And the Indian Ocean. Let's see. Any other questions? I'm going through a book written by an RN officer that has sources from his days as a midshipman. It's quite good to see someone from that perspective. It is always fun. It's one of the reasons why I enjoy the book The Battle on the Breeze, which I can't see around me at the moment, but it's somewhere. King's Rook. I believe the Park Fortress were the Canadian equivalents to Liberties, while the Victories were later ships. Let me just check. Let's see. All right, so. I do have an article somewhere on this. There are Empire ships, Park ships, and Park ships and Fort ships were the Canadian equivalent of it, and Victory ships. There are multiple of those, but yeah, lots of them, lots of different ones. Liberty ships is a catch-all, but there are lots of different ones. Dove Squad. Hello, Dove Squad. Is it me, or is it the pattern that people that run down the Italian Navy Model 2 also run down the Royal Navy Model 2 vis-a-vis USN? Let's put it this way. If you are prepared to, you can start saying that the Royal Navy was really second class or really low. If you can say the reason, if you can say, well, look, they are having to deal with the Italian Navy, they're having to deploy so many ships to the Mediterranean and deal, therefore, that's really how weak they are because they're having to do that. Whereas the Italian Navy is really not up to much, Honestly, the Italian Navy, as I've said before, is the most balanced and probably best strategically best position of all three of the Axis powers to actually try and deliver on its war aims. It can't, but it's still the best position of the three. But there are a lot of people who will be careful when people are trying to press a stereotype, because stereotypes rarely ever exist, especially in history. Humans are a bit more complicated. I'm worried about you all on the Blackburn. I'm seriously worried. Okay. Now, this is definitely a book which I was very happy to see come through my door. It's a lovely book. United States Navy Destroyers, Images of War by Michael Green. And it is a gorgeous book. For anyone's interested, lots and lots of pictures, just enough writing to be cool, lots of detail. And it goes really up to the modern ones. Zumwalt's origins, CGX, a bit of that details about that. You see how cool Zumwalt looks. It gives you a full overview of radar fire control, all the various things it goes through. Models. Insides and outsides of the turrets. Which is always nice. Also, you can start to see why the Royal Navy was... you see, it's going to sound strange. This is one of the reasons, what's happened to this turret is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy was so cautious about putting turrets on its destroyers. Because if the turret has to be too light, that means the metal's going to be quite thin. And what you end up with is a blowout. And that kills all the crew inside. So you have some protection. Yes, you have protection from splinters. But you don't have protection from much else. Dev Squad, would the Spruce Goose have been a reasonable way to beat the U-boat threat had convoys and ASW not worked? I presume so. Durand so the answer is yes, but, well, the answer is yes, they do tend to undervalue the IJN. They also tend to play down the threat of the Kriegsmarine surface raiders. So it's one of the things is, why does the Royal Navy keep a load of battleships? In European waters, in home waters, because of the threat of German surface raiders. And the thing is, the enemy can pick when they're going to come out. You have to be ready for them to come out when they come out. So it requires numbers. And it's the same with the Mediterranean. The Italians can pick when they're launching. And this is, again, my big problem with people going, oh, the Eastern Fleet doesn't get any resources. Well, what's the Royal Navy doing in 1942? Let's have a look at what operations take place in 1942. So, you have the Channel Dash in February 1942. That kind of keeps the Royal Navy's worrying about the things. You've, of course, also had the Battle of Java Sea and the fall of Singapore, also in February 1942. Operation Chariot takes place on St. Nazaire in March 1942. You have Operation Ironclad, the invasion of Madagascar. In May 1942, which we've already done a video about. You have Convoy PQ-17 in June 1942. You have the Siege of Tobruk. You have Operation Harpoon in the Mediterranean, a reinforcement of Malta. So much going on. You have the Battle of El Alamein taking place in July 1942. So you need a lot of supplies. Battle Atlantic is really heating up. August 1942, Operation Torch Planning Team. Starts organising and meeting up in Washington. Then there's Operation Pedestal, Operation Jubilee. Second Battle of El Alamein takes place in October 1942. That's required a lot of supplies to get through to it. Ooh, November, Operation Supercharge, Allied breakout of El Alamein. And December 1942. Operation Frankton. And Operation Husky. Well, basically, the arrive in North Africa for Operation Husky. So, Operation Torch must have taken place as well somewhere now. Yeah. Operation Torch. Operation Torch takes place in November 1942. So yeah, I can't think what else the Royal Navy was doing in the world other than sort of supplying a massive fleet to counter the Japanese in the Indian Ocean. They really had nothing else going on. Nutty Happy One. Only reason to get 15 total 6 and add what missing to the 4 destroyer class. Probably. Jeff Beeler, the Canadians are very vocal in the chat. Well, you know, we like having the Canadians here. Nutty Happy One. Doc, is there a great Flag class book? Ooh. I do have a big book on the Flag class somewhere, but I can't see it around me at the moment. It's got to be somewhere around here, but I can't see it. Not for the life of me. Yeah, you can. Operation Husky was August 1943. Yes, but the supplies for Operation Husky were starting to be brought across in 1942. So, various armoured divisions, the supplies for them. You have to remember, you don't just move a division across an ocean. If you are transporting an entire division across the ocean, it comes with a pretty hefty escort. Because if you turn around to the Americans and go, I'm sorry, Scharnhorst broke out and sunk your entire division, they get a bit upset. So you have to send a bit of a battleship along with them. And again, I'll go through this book just quickly because we've got off topic, but, you know, has some great stuff in it, great content. You can see how big the torpedoes were and how they cleaned the torpedo tubes. That's what you have small people on the ship for. You can stuff them in the torpedo tube. Really great pictures in this book. Really great pictures in this book. And it really does go through the various classes and what they get up to. And what they look like. They look kind of cute. Chronicle, Operation Better was a decisive CV battle in the decisive theatre in 1942. Potentially. Trafalgar, the Royal Navy had nothing else going on in 1942. Well, that's... Every time I read a book which basically says the Royal Navy is not providing anything and not providing enough in the Eastern Fleet, and therefore the Eastern Fleet is terrible, and it shows how weak Britain was, I sit there and go, well, what is Britain actually doing in 1942? It has to provide a fleet large enough to deter, but that's what it's doing, and it does the deterrence job pretty well. The Japanese don't tend to... they only want to come into the Indian Ocean in force, and they don't tend to stick around for a long time. And if they'd had more submarines, etc. And as Sean Mack says, King says, I'm increasing allocations to the Pacific. But he can only do that because the British then have to increase allocations to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So King can afford to reduce the Pacific because then the British have to do the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So here's the thing. If the Americans were doing a larger contribution to the Atlantic, the British would probably have a larger contribution to the Indian Ocean. Swings and roundabouts. You still need the resources. That's good. The more men and equipment that the Axis could sink and sea, the easier the fighting on the ground would be. How true is it that the unexhausted fast liners were subproof? They were very, very quick. They were incredibly quick. And yes, zigzag and things to make it more complicated, but they were very quick. And they managed to get through quite a lot. Stratus, you can add to your CV that you created a biplane cult. How many professor candidates can claim to have started a religion nowadays? That actually disturbingly might work. Jeff Baylor, given the need for refits, what would the Iron Pacific fleet have looked like in 1926? It would have still been growing, and you would have probably got a lot of ships coming out of refit, because remember, a lot of ships are stuck into refit in 1945. The idea being they'd be available in 1946. I think possibly HMS Vanguard would have been hurried up. If World War II had gone into 46, 47, I think you could have well found a Vanguard appearing in a British Pacific fleet. Shomak, I was saying that it would happen if a US division got sunk at sea. Oh, yes, it would. But he says that anyway. And said, if you lose a division at sea, whatever you do, King's always wanting to increase the allocation to the Pacific. And the reason he's wanting to increase the allocation to the Pacific is because he sees that as America's war. He sees Europe as the European war. Hello, Dan Freeman. You and Richard Dawkins. I don't want to be in that same group. It's quite a terrible group to be in. Okay, so this is a very, very cool book. 231.30. Dev Scott, I am now imagining a Pie Creek built freighter. Probably could take its own dock with it if it was in the size of proposed Pie Creek carrier. Oh, it could do. I don't know. I sneaked in about an hour ago. Oh, cool. So, Thompson, how many admirals and captains were upset with themselves in Korea for not having Vanguard? Oh, that would have been so useful. But you must remember, if you have a Pie Creek carrier appear in World War II, you can't imagine that the world would have got over Pie Creek carriers today. Just think of that. If Pie Creek had worked in World War II, the odds are we would have had Pie Creek aircraft carriers the whole way through the Cold War. So, this book is really, really cool. The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze by G.R.G. Worcester. And this is a pen and sword book. But you have to remember that this book was originally published and originally written a long time ago. It's 1971 Naval Institute Press. But Mr. Worcester died in 1669. So here's a prefatory note. My friend and colleague, the late G.R.G. Worcester, Esquire, the author of this beautiful book, had a long and notable career in the Chinese Customs Service. He was for many years an officer in the Customs River Inspectorate, which was responsible for the control and importation of improvement of navigation on the Yangtze River. Mr. Worcester, on the Yangtze River. It was during his years on this great river, which he came to know like the back of his hand, that he devoted himself to the study of the junks described in this book. Mr. Worcester died in England in 1969, happy in the knowledge that his work was to be published in its present form. In a dispatch of Lord Salisbury in 1885, Sir Robert Haarr, Inspector General of Chinese Customs Service, wrote, "The service which I direct is called a customs service, but its scope is wide and its aim is to do good work for China in every possible direction. This simple creed has guided the unique Chinese Customs Service ever since it was founded in 1854. Its chief function was, of course, the collection of the revenue on an extensive foreign trade, but it also did good work for China, in many fields far removed from conventional customs responsibilities. This versatile civil service actively encouraged the writing and publication of books by its members on a broad range of subjects concerning the great country it served. The most recent and noteworthy books by a customs author was Mr. Worcester's definitive work on Chinese junks. Originally published by the Customs in Shanghai in a rather limited edition, the books are now out of print and collector's items. With a growing interest in and concern with China and the Far East, it is therefore timely and fitting that the Junks and Sampans of Yangtze, revised and expanded, should be published by the United States Naval Institute, and thus permit a wide reading public to enjoy the romantic story of these age-old craft." In the prefatory note to Mr. Worcester's first book, Junks and Sampans of the Upper Yangtze, 1940, Sir Frederick Mars, the Inspector General of Customs, pointed out that the Chinese have probably shown more originality than any other people in the art of shipbuilding, and commented on their ingenuity in designing vessels to suit special requirements and different conditions. We of the West are inclined to think that the construction of ships for specialized purposes, tankers, bulk carriers, or boats, is a relatively recent development. Mr. Worcester shows that centuries ago the Chinese built highly sophisticated vessels for a great variety of special purposes. Local waters, of course, for special vessels. The shallow waters of the western Szechuan, the tumultuous rapids between Chongqing and Yingshan, the broad reaches of the lower river, and the open ocean demand different kinds of craft. Within these broad categories, from humble and ubiquitous sampan to the great three-masted junks of Foshan, there are hundreds of different types, each designed for efficient and economical use. This unique book is a comprehensive and authoritative record of the vessels, which for centuries provided practically the sole means of communication and transportation in the vast area drained by one of the world's greatest waterways. Mr. Worcester pays deserved respect and admiration to the generations of humble but skilled men who built the junks. These shipwrights, working with their crude tools, designed and constructed boats which incorporated such advanced features as the watertight bulkhead and the balanced rudder. The men and women who sailed the junks were, as Mr. Worcester says, a simple, unlettered, yet highly skilled people who for generations have cheerfully and unquestioningly accepted a life of unmitigated hardship. That he can add that, in his long experience, he has never met an unpleasant junkman is high praise for these fine sailors. As in other maritime countries, steam and internal combustion engines, with their superior speed and economy, have already supplanted the sail and oar on certain routes and in certain types of vessels in China. This development must inevitably continue. Yet even today, an immense tonnage of cargo and uncounted thousands of passengers are carried by junks described in this book. Moreover, they may figure prominently in future naval and military operations, as in fact the craft indigenous to Southeast Asia are doing as this is being written. These remarkable craft deserve an unusual biographer, and Mr. Worcester, they have found one. Sailor, artist, and student of history. He was first of all a sailor, whose lifetime career was conservative ships, steam and sail. He was also a talented dancer and producer, not only of a profusion of scale drawings of many junks and their accessories, but also delicate sketches which illustrate the text. Lastly, he went deeply into the history of the subject and gave up the results of his research, which happily include folklore, legends, and romance, which have followed the wake of these fascinating craft. And that is written by L.K. Little, Inspector General, retired, Chinese Customs Service. This is a very, very cool book, and I can show you why. But it is very expensive. If you are interested in this area of history, if you're interested in understanding naval architecture, naval construction, and you're interested in the idea of sailing ships, and junks especially, you will love this book. You will find it very well written. You will find it very easy to follow and read, and very, very inclusive. I would call this book the Encyclopedia of Junks, because, frankly, I can't imagine there being a better book anywhere. Now, I'm sure there are some Chinese-authored books which probably are just as inclusive and just as exhaustive, but I can't read them. But I can read this one. Right. How much longer would formidable and illustrious everlasting warsos, as long as they were needed? Bren Kennel. Yes, the M word is something we don't know. I did have to mention him earlier, but I prefer not to. Trent Lenko. Pie Creek carriers to B-52s? The mind boggles. Talk about really revolting US admirals in rebellion. Well, imagine if you do have a Pie Creek Navy, imagine the effect on the Royal Navy. Imagine the effect on all navies. Suddenly, the construction of those ships becomes tremendously different. And also, imagine the construction effect it would have on bridges, tunnels. If you build a tunnel underwater, could you build a Pie Creek? It's an interesting thing to talk about. Dev Squad, the Chinese wouldn't have to build islands if they could build the mobile Pie Creek ones. No, they wouldn't. But if war continued, light fleet carriers would have probably also continued, but which would be ready for the service in 1946. Light fleet carriers and the full fleet carriers. Remember, there are some fleet carriers, the Audacious class and others on the construction as well. So, if war continues in 1946-47, how much further along are they? I love the story myth about sampan design. Designer comes in with a beautiful ship design. Emperor retorts by throwing a shoe at him and tells him to design a boat around that. Peter A. Dawson. If war lasted until 1940, could have got the Audacious class aircraft carriers in the current timeline. Yeah. 91. Doc, strange question. If Canada had bought those BBs over years between World War I and World War II, the UK wanted us Canadians to have, would World War II be different? Queen class and other numbers unknown would have been different. Probably you'd have seen the Canadians take far more active role in the surface in operations engagements in the North Sea, in North Atlantic and North Sea. Maybe they'd have supplied a battleship to the Pacific Fleet. I'm not sure. Stephenson, I got to read an old copy of that back in the day in Lounge at Lion's Head Harbour. It was an amazing book, and can't believe how much they're worth now. I wonder if that copy is still there. This is the new one, and it's £40. But it is gorgeous. That's good. Being able to cast one-piece hulls without really needing massive building facilities would revolutionize shipbuilding. Yep. Rekeeping the Iron's fleet carriers on operations as long as World War II carried on. I have visions of Illustrious being interesting as the vibrations got worse and worse. Oh, they would have been fun, but it would have been a case of, we need a fleet carrier, this thing still floats and goes just about fast enough. Okay. Chief, carry on. Fine. 2 more new books to go, and then we'll be working through questions. Hello. Let's see. Bringing out. Did that book discuss Japanese coastal trunks in World War II? Was being distracted. It mostly focuses on the ones in the Yangtze, but if from memory, it does have a discussion of them. It is. It's one of those books, if you love naval history, if you love history of sailing or ship design, all those things, this is a gorgeous book to have. And the fact that it was sent to me to do a book review of has just made me a very, very happy man. Because it is an absolutely gorgeous book. Right. So, let's do that one. Now, this book is slightly different from some of the others, but it does follow on from the Worcester one quite nicely because it's about a sort of early age of sail, galley battle. It's Lepanto. It's 1571, and it's Nic Fields' new book. And it's good. I like this book. Dev Squad, a Pike Creek icebreaker, an oxymoron. The first icebreaker which would be repaired by the very thing it's breaking up. Jeff Miller, the three Canadian QEs would have had British crews, would have replaced the Iron Dukes and then R-Class in the post-war RN. Probably modernised like the other QEs, like the Malaya, really RN in all but name. So whether they survived the treaties. Probably do. Man the measure. Technology must match man. Man is the measure. The story of the formidable Ottoman bow is a classic example. Obviously, archery was still a highly valued battlefield skill in the Ottoman Empire. This formidable skill was not easily acquired, the archers practicing constantly. While resident in Constantinople, Busbek took up the Ottoman bow, a weapon he writes with which the Turks are extraordinarily skillful. The Flemish diplomat continues at some length. They begin to shoot at 8 or 7, even 7 years of age, and practice continuously for 10 or 12 years. The result is that their arms become exceedingly strong, and they become so expert that no objective is too small for them to hit. The bows which they use are considerably stouter than ours, and being shorter, easier to handle. They are not made of a single piece of wood, but of sinew and ox horns fastened with glue and flax. A Turk, after long practice, can easily draw the string, or even the stoutest bow, right back to his ear. Yet anyone, however strong, who was unaccustomed to this kind of bow, could not draw it sufficiently far to release a coin fixed between the bow and the string in the angle where the latter is attached to the notch. They wear on the thumb of the right hand rings of bone, on which the string rests when they pull it, while the arrow is held in check by the knuckle of the joint of the left thumb, which is extended, a very different method from ours. You sort of imagine a sort of action like this. Sort of. Not resting on the knuckle, back like this. It's interesting listening to the Turkish bows because, again, you've got the Dutch talking about their bows, and then you've got the longbow, and it's a debate over how quickly and what side you draw and all these things. So it's always interesting listening to them talk about this thing and describe it. And it gives you some idea of the difficulty of operating these things. Heuvel's book is clearly describing the Turkish use of the composite recurve bow. Composite means that it was made of more than one material. A wooden core, backed by the sinews and bellied, with horn glued on in layers. The bow was held together with a natural, water-soluble fish or bone glue, and then waterproofed by lacquering. The thumb ring was normally made of horn, but could also be made out of bone or ivory. Recurve means that when the bow was unstrung, it curved in the opposite direction from which it was strung. In other words, the act of stringing the bow made the lamination of the sinews the back of the stave, the nose to resist stretching, and the horn the belly to resist compression. The composite construction gave it extra strength, and the recurve gave it extra power. This meant that greater latent power could be stored in the bow than could be stored by bending a straight stick. More powerful even than the famed English longbow, and even many types of bullet, a well-made composite recurve bow could shoot an arrow through an iron breastplate or 15 millimeters of wood at close range, say 50 to 100 meters. The Janissaries carried their arrows and bows ready for use at a moment's notice, in the combination case that hung from their waist belt. With its strongly double-curved silhouette, most archery experts agreed that with the Ottoman composite recurve bow, this weapon reached the epitome of its form and effectiveness. For strength and firepower, beauty of design and accuracy, plus the expert application of ancient craftsman knowledge, Ottoman bows were the commanding weapon on the battlefields of Western Asia until the use of firearms became prevalent in the 19th century. But a highest quality bow, glue that was made either from tendons or a combination of the ears or hide of cattle and skinned from the roof of the mouth of a Danube sturgeon, had to be cooked. The most common wood used as the core of the bow was maple because of its ability to accept the glue. An excellent bowyer knew exactly where and when to find the best trees to use to obtain this particular wood. Horn that was appropriate for the bow had to be smooth and free of any imperfections, while the pieces for the top and bottom of the bow had to be near identical as was possible. Without a doubt, tradition is not always irrational. The retention of the highly effective composite recurve bow by the Ottoman armies, used with devastating effect on the hosts of Peter Alexeyevich of Russia as late as the 4-day Battle of Stanton in the 18th to 21st of July 1711, is an excellent case in point. It is noteworthy, however, that the basic accoutrements of the Ottoman bow, the glues, sinew, horn, and wood used in its construction, as well as the thumb ring, arrows, and quiver, had remained basically unchanged over the millennia. This is a very, very cool book. To be honest, using bows from the age of 7 is quite common in some of the medieval ages and medieval period. You have English longbone. They start very, very young. So yeah, you are going to have developmental issues, but also you tend to start with a lighter bow and work your way up to a heavier bow, a full war bow. Hello, Bazaski and Felix B. That's good. I will confess it doesn't make sense. The distortions seen in the archer skeletons on Mary Rose et al. Show overdeveloped muscle insert points and shoulders, but not elbow changes. English longbowmen. They started with the bowman's grandfather. To be fair, they started the bowman's great-great-grandfather. I'm going to have to remember to make sure I get to bed on time this week. I keep working till about 3 a.m. in the morning, and it's not doing me any good. I have no idea what that was. 0256 0257. It's new, but I don't think this is pen and sword. It's Dead Reckoning. And if any students of mine look at this and go, why haven't you done et al. For the last book's names? Well, it's quite simple. Because as I'm talking about the whole book, I thought it'd be fair to mention all 4 authors. God's they don't pay you enough to work that long. No, no one does. But the trouble is, I get into the work, and then I forget the time, and then I realise the time about 3 a.m. in the morning, and go, oh. To be honest, it takes a village to make a bowman. Kingsroot, at least you're staying up for a reason, not because you're in pain. Yes. Instead of wake up alarm, you need a stop working alarm. I am getting one of those. So, last book from today. The Stringbags. Garth Ennis, PJ Holden, Kelly Fitzpatrick, and Rob Stein. And I'm reviewing this for the Strategy Bridge, and I'm going to send them a written review, but I thought I'd add this in here, because it's really quite cool. It's full of some fairly good cartoons, fairly good drawings, really quite nice to read. I have to admit that I did manage to make Jamie's blood pressure go through the roof by describing what they described about the fairy Fulmar, but we'll leave that to one side. It's interesting. It has all sorts of things in it. That's a lot of crew, a lot of flight crew in there. I do realise that theoretically 24 times 3 is 72, but it's actually roughly times 2 for all of them, so it's 48. And that just feels more than 48. Because there's something like 8 on the front row, and then there's... Actually, there's about 10 on the front row, and there's about 6, 7 rows back from that. So it does feel a bit more. But it is a very, very cool book. And it's something different. You don't get this much, so definitely a Christmas buy. I like the drawings. I like the quality of it. It does have a lot of fun research. Yeah. Get up to a lot of interesting stuff in here. Fun. Dan Freeman, it's only 4 officers. That isn't too bad. Some things end up with a dozen. Yeah, I won't tell you what I think about those ones which end up with a dozen. But my honest opinion is that those aren't really... how to put it? Those aren't really written by a dozen people. Those have all sorts of... They are Christmas tree works, which have all sorts of names tacked onto them. For various reasons. Ooh. Jabilla, it was the Dutch tanker Udina and the corvette HMS Bengal, which sank one Japanese armed merchant cruiser and drove off the other with one 4-inch and one 3-inch gun, respectively. The AMCs had 8 5.5-inch. So, Thompson, we won't mind if you need to blow your nose, so just hope you're not getting sick. I don't think I'm getting sick. I don't feel getting sick. I've been in the attic and all sorts of things, and I'm tired. So, as you can see, I need to get sleep. Dev Squad, in my experience in politics league, the massive author list books are usually chapters made from edited papers compiled into a book. That's true. So, Q&A session. Until the Iron Brew runs out. Or until roughly 9:30. Because then I'll give my voice a rest, because it's been talking a lot today. Dan Freeman, look after yourself. There is only one of you. I'm not sure. I think I'm cloning myself. Fun fact, by courtesy of Calum Gasbay, a horseback archer firing backwards at a pursuing enemy adds significantly to the arrow's penetration and power. That doesn't surprise me somehow. Unless Track really is a clone. It has been fun. Lots of work and a very sick little puppy at one point. The combination of being between 8 and 10 weeks old and having pneumonia and teething makes for a fun puppydom. Death Squad, is your brother sister texting? I only have a sister. I have lots of cousins, but I only have a sister. No, it was someone texted me to tell me to look after myself and stop trying to work myself to coma. But part of the problem is that I do have to admit we have a hot air heating system in this house. And when I go outside, I'm fine. When I come inside, especially my bedroom at the moment, if I have the window closed because it's cold, and the way the hot air system works, it blows dust straight around everywhere, and so you get dust constantly. How Maxie, I actually do have a friend who looks like he could be Dr. Clark's twin. Cool. I'm enjoying Stafford Thompson. I am enjoying your works. I haven't had time to respond to them, but I am enjoying them. BFW, do you have any suggestions for reading on the causes and reasoning of the Royal Navy moving from Calabar to Stubble aircraft carriers? As I said earlier, I'd say the best one to get is Norman Freeman's British Carrier Aviation. That covers it in quite a significant detail. I also do have a book somewhere wandering around. The Age of Invincible by Nic Fields. Let's go into it in quite a bit. Have the answers, BFW. Calvin Drac is suspected to be a platoon of clones connected to a hive mind. Oh, that wouldn't surprise me. Comes Academia says, if you're not working, you are not worthy. Pretty much. Was thinking about capital ship names for future SSA and SSBNs. Do you think there will be another HS Hood, or are circumstances of sinking still considered too traumatic? Naming after admirals, naming ships after admirals, barring Admiral Duncan, is politically occasionally a bit problematic when it's ships at sea, because what do they do in their lives? Recent controversies and people trying to make claims and all sorts of things about slavery and all sorts of issues, which as we said, we had the Nelson controversy, which is potentially published after he died, which may have been written by him, but may not have been, and we don't know what letter was written in reply to. Nelson may or may not have expressed certain views, And you sit there and go, okay, that's fine, but that's Nelson. And actually, he was often at sea and really didn't get involved in these things. Hood was a lot more political. Really, a lot more political. Ian Carter, I'm sorry about that. To hear that your Jack Russell has an unadmitted issue. Hope she gets better soon. I'm sure they'll be worthy, and I'm sure they will contribute to the 30th chat. Mind voting, get you in there, Stafford Thompson. But it's more a case of the book's winding down, but then things come in and they need to be done then. Bringenner, would be nice to have a class named after Fleet Air Maces. They are far too well known. Agreed, but I doubt it'll happen. Well, there is a debate of that, because you want the largest ice-breaking warship. And You see, the reason that's an issue is because I would go the Project 22220 icebreakers. Well, they're technically not warships, but knowing the Russians, they could be quickly adapted to warships. So those are what I'd be looking at. And they're the biggest and heaviest, I think. Currently. What's the largest ice-breaking warship you see being built? Oh, probably it's going to be one of the Russian nuclear-powered ones. They're always going to build bigger because their status is that we have the biggest. That's good. I think another reason not to name another ship after Major Hood is respect for the roughly 1,400 crew who are still on patrol. We'd always hoped that'd be a reason, but honestly, that is a reason which can be got round with on politics. It's the same with Howard Maxey, with your point of admirals who were killed who died in service. They don't tend to get ships named after them unless they die gloriously in service. Nelson, basically. Greg Sadowski, wouldn't the largest ice-breaking warship technically be something like an SSBM? I don't really think that they are icebreakers. They might surface through ice, but I don't really treat them as icebreakers. I think if they do build a proper warship, it'll probably be something along the lines of an LHA, but with destroyer capabilities. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a combi ship, because it's going to have nuclear reactors. Especially if it's the Russians. As I said earlier, my plan is to go on to probably about 9:30ish, as we've gone through all the books. Mainly because I'm hearing the large fluffy wolf make a few noises downstairs. Death Squad died in service and had a good dose of Victorian mythologizing about 100 years later. That does help. It really does. What topics are coming up this week on Bilge Pumps? Missiles. So, Dr. Clark, do you think Russia or America will be the first to produce an Arctic LHD for far north resource security? It'll be Russia. It'll always be Russia for far north, because Russia has to think about it constantly. For America, it's a would like to have. For Russia, it's a have to have. America, it's about securing access to Alaska. And as long as they can still do that, they're okay. And basically for that, they need a railway line built through Canada. And they have a railway line through Canada, but, you know. Actually, they don't, do they? Now they did plan on one, wasn't? Well, possibly to do one. I think they do. It just passes through Canada, I'm fairly sure. It goes anywhere. Durskod, the kind of wolf that says if I don't go soon, you'll be the one cleaning up results. No, not that one. I took him for a good walk earlier. It's the one which says I'd really like to go and I'll be a lot happier if I do go. RCN Type 26 will have tomahawks. That's good. They do. Oh, good. It was recently approved. Ah. Breckencanner, looking for a good text on Kos and Leros. Can you suggest anything? Not really. King's if they are saying where to get icebreakers large in the dwells, what kind of ships would they be? Oh, they will probably be hybrid ships which will be part LPH, maybe with limited small boat offloading facilities, and part probably destroyer, because honestly, anti-submarine warfare operations if you're doing anti-submarine warfare, it's going to sound strange. You can't really do a towed sonar array as an icebreaker. The sonar is going to be too delicate. You can't also, your helicopters can't really do dipping operations. And if you're going along cracking up water, you're creating a lot of noise and disturbance in the water anyway, and cracking up the ice. There's a whole debate as to whether or not a torpedo could still hit you if they could use a torpedo to take you down in the ice. But again, that's quite an interesting operation for a submarine to try and do. So I'd say it more as a sort of air warfare general purpose ship with possibly some anti-submarine capabilities. But again, you're not going to have a sonar on the bow, so you're not going to have a bow-mounted sonar. You're not even going to have a hull-mounted sonar. I have no idea how you have a sonar on an icebreaker that is remotely going to have a chance of still being working. The depth dropped off the back, possibly? That's potentially the only way. But to try and protect that from getting disturbed too much by your torpedo propellers, you'd have to have them canted. Oh, that would be very, very interesting. Coming out, Russia's reactivated at least one Arctic base. Yep. Down. So will the upcoming build trumps be about how to play a nice big game of rock, paper, exocet? Possibly. I doubt the USS Rush will be coming back too soon. Jeff Hitter, Pearl Harbor and paper cruisers this week. Should I see HMS Surrey? Yes. But sonar on a drone sub? How would you guarantee communication with it below the ice? It becomes all sorts of problematic. All sorts of problems. Can't answer, but an icebreaker as a passive sonar drone mothership works in theory. Potentially, but that's still going to be quite complicated to communicate with. Ice is not exactly the easiest thing to get signals through. So one of the reasons why submarines surface in the ice is to get actual communication going on. Thank you, Stephenson. That's good. I imagine that the Russian thermal-guided torpedoes would work well against icebreakers. What about halo-dropped sonar buys on all data linked to the icebreaker destroyer? Well, again, if you use sonar buoys, they glance off the ice. You need a sonar buoy that buries itself through the ice somehow, because the sonar buoy sitting on top of the ice is not going to tell you what's going on beneath it. And then it's going to need to maintain signal coming through. As for the thermal torpedoes, well, maybe, but icebreakers tend to have very thick double hulls, double skin hulls, and if it's a military built one, you've got to imagine it's going to have some protection for its engines, which means they're going to be rafted. And if the engines are rafted and it's got a double hull, how much heat is it really going to be getting on the outer hull? So, and that's going to be quite a thick hull as well, because the stress is going to, the very job the icebreaker has to do makes it a very hard hull to take down with modern weapons. It just, yeah. And as Dunrick Arnhem said, subs connected with cable, and then Brendan Kennel pointed out chunks of Goodbye Ice are bad for cables. That they are. HMS Edinburgh 1882 was a Colossus-class battleship built as HMS Majestic, but renamed 2 days before being launched in 1882. She was sold in 1910, so potential name for CVA-02 was used for a BB. She was named HMS Edinburgh, not HMS Duke of Edinburgh. There is a difference. There is a difference between called Duke of Edinburgh and HMS Edinburgh. Edinburgh is the capital city of Scotland. Duke of Edinburgh is the Queen's spouse. There's a difference. I'm sorry. Yes, there could have been an HMS Edinburgh, but that wouldn't have been HMS Duke of Edinburgh, like it also wouldn't have been HMS Edinburgh Castle. And at one point, the Royal Navy does have an HMS Edinburgh Castle in service. So... Mm-hmm. Oh, the sub-brief channel recently discussed a new self-deploying sonar array. There are all sorts of these ideas, but again, it's working through the ice. Jeff Yeller, HMS Duke of Edinburgh was a Duke of Edinburgh class armoured cruiser launched in 1984 and sold in 1920. Yes, cruiser. Not capital ship. Cruiser. The name's on the books. Not used for capital ships. Don't worry, Jeff. It's... I have this debate with many people on a regular basis because it is one of the most enduring CVA-01 myths. Prince of Wales, it might have been. But unlikely at that point because Prince of Wales in 1970, in the 1960s and 70s, was still persona non grata name, really. So I think it would have been Ark Royal. Jeff Beeler, bigger than the Edinburgh BB. Yes, the cruiser was bigger than the Edinburgh battleship. But the battleships by the time 1904... Well, let's be honest, 1904 is when it's launched. 1905 is when HMS Dreadnought ended service. Mainly 1640. So what you're saying is you'll need armor-piercing sonar buoys. No, something far more complicated to get through than armor. Ice-piercing sonar buoys. God knows how you could do that. Jeff Hiller, will Formidable and Indomitable come back? We can always hope. Yickers. Clark, there's an interesting documentary out there about the highway built to Alaska in World War II by mainly African American Engineering Corps. Yeah, I've seen it. It was a good one. So, any last questions? And I hope you've enjoyed this evening. I know I have. And thank you again to Osprey28 and all the others. And Jeff, I think, who've done the super chats. It's always nice. They go for my Book and Iron Brew Fund. And at the moment, my great big garden shed fund. Because we've just been told to have it fitted, we need a new... When they check the electrics, we've had a friend of the family check it, and we also had two other electricians check it, and basically we've been told we need a new circuit board. Because they need... The circuit board we have in this house came with this house. And basically to expand it and extend it to make it up. And so if we're going to do the modifications we need to do to have the electricity taken to the outside, we would need to fit something onto it because it's not big enough. And when they did the test, they basically said, right, that can't have anything fitted on it because it's so old. So you need a new one. So that's going to be fun. New circuit board and the electrics to be laid. King's Rook. Possibly an armoured housing for a sonar icebreaker? Yeah. Ooh. It would be complicated, expensive, and a lot of things which could go wrong. Dev Squad. Naming a ship after the Monarch consort gets complicated when you run the precedent back of the Monarchs to who had official, unofficial, and semi-official consorts. Yeah. To get through ice, you would need some sustained or repetitive blows, or so something that lands on the ice and then bangs its way through the drop somewhere. Or you would need something which gets very, very hot and melts its way through the sonar boy, through the ice. Tav Johnson, pleasure, thank you. Yickers, yeah. Carl, pleasure, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, King's Rook. Thanks, Yickers. Thanks, John Shea. Thank you, Derp Squad. Thank you, Dunragan Hammer. Thank you, DGV40. Thank you, Carl Kasberg. Thank you, DM Carter. And thank you, St. Kitts. Thank you, Jess P. It's very kind of you. Thank you. Oh, as I said, everything's going on the shed now. Hot and melting through is likely a no-go. Yes, it's likely a no-go because if it's that hot enough to melt through the ice, it's probably going to damage the sonar. And the energy requirements. Dan Freeman, I now have visions of an entire class of ships in the RN named after King Charles II's mistresses. And his illegitimate children. Have a check on it. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And in quick answer, Derp Squad. They're planning a mission to one of Jupiter's Saturn's moons that will melt its way through the ice. That's going to be interesting. How does Academia deal with BWFW? How does Academia deal with classification of modern ships, given that every navy seems to have its own opinion of what is a frigate or destroyer? By going nuts. Thank you, only 1640. Take care, Dan Freeman. Thank you, Staff Thompson. Thank you, Greg Stowski. Thank you, Calvin Gasbird. Thank you. Take care. Take care, Yogi Khan. Kahidran. Take care, Howard Maxey. Thank you. Take care. Basically, thank you and take care, everyone. It's been lovely as always.